All right, good afternoon. Welcome everybody. Welcome to day 2 of our DSH Diversion Academy. Today we are going to be focusing on how to define and identify the DSH diversion population. We do have a really packed agenda today with a lot of good stuff to share with you. So I want to kind of move through the first part of this relatively quickly so that we can make sure that we have enough time for all of the stuff. So before we get into the agenda, I just wanted to go over some of the technical items again with you all. Just like last time, on the far right-hand side of your computer screen, you can open up different panels. One is a participant panel, which will show you all of the panelist names and then all of the attendee names. And you can also open up your chat box through there as well, and that's how you can send messages either to any of the panelists and myself. I do think it's best if you can message to all attendees unless it's a technical issue you're having, but it's nice if everybody can see any questions that come in through the chat. And then you can also use the various buttons on your panel. The mitten-looking one is the raise hand feature, so that's a way to let us know that you have a comment or a question that you would like to ask. And we can unmute you and let you ask a question. And the others are just, we're going too fast, going too slow, or you want to send in a little emoji of encouragement, then that's welcome as well. A couple reminders, please to make sure you are all muted when you are not speaking, just so we can limit the background noise. We are recording this session. We also had, I think, a bit of an issue with echoing last time, so making sure that your sound is muted will help with that. Next to, if you scroll on your attendee list, next to your name, there should be both a microphone button and a camera button, and that is how you can turn your camera on and off and your muting on and off. So just a reminder there. You are welcome to send in questions to us at any time. Just please use that chat feature. And some tips and tricks that I wanted to share just from the last time. If you are using your phone to call in and connect to this meeting for the audio part, I do recommend that you use the phone audio option of having WebEx call you instead of you calling into WebEx. There's an option for the system to call you and you put in your phone number. By doing that, WebEx will automatically connect your phone audio to your login on your computer. And that's really important because if your phone audio is not connected to your computer login, when we go into the breakout session, your computer will go, but your audio won't. So we need to make sure those things are connected. And like I said, if you are calling in on your phone and using your computer, make sure your computer sound is muted, because then we won't get that echoing that we were getting sometimes during the last session. And I'm hearing somebody typing. So if everybody can please make sure they are on mute. And then I do have a couple updates. We had a few technical issues during the last session. And unfortunately, the two main ones are ones that are just limitations of the platform. The WebEx training platform does not apparently support camera use during the breakout sessions, which is a bummer, but I think it's the platform, and this is what we have to use, unfortunately. So I'm sorry about that. I know it doesn't make for the best breakout session, but I hope you all can just bear with us. And you know, you have great facilitators, so I'm sure they'll be able to work it out and make it go as smoothly as possible. All right. So our agenda today, just went through the welcome and housekeeping. I do also want to mention before I go any further that we have two guests with us today. Aside from our partners at the Council of State Governments, we have Dr. Deb Peinel joining us today. She's a national expert on all things related to behavioral health and the behavioral health population with justice involvement. And then also Dr. Sarah Demray, another national expert who will be speaking to you all about risk assessments a little bit later today. We're going to go through some Q&A that we collected from the last session, and then we're going to move into the main part of today's training session, which is going to focus on, like I said before, how to identify who is appropriate for this program and how your diversion program is going to be able to find the right types of folks to refer and the different screenings and assessments you can do to make sure that they are a good fit for the program and somebody that ultimately your courts will be willing to order into the program. All right. So as I mentioned, we're going to do some follow-up Q&A from our last session right now. So during your break, all of your breakout sessions, your facilitators will go ahead and collect any questions that you have that we aren't able to answer during the training session itself. And we're going to start each of our ongoing sessions with a short follow-up Q&A session where we answer those questions. So I will be going through the questions we received. We did consolidate a number of those questions. Some of them had kind of similar themes from the last round, so you might not see your specific question or your exact question, but hopefully we've captured the essence of those. And then there were some questions we received that we won't be addressing here because some of them are on topics that are related more to like treatment and housing, and those are actually questions that we can address during some of our upcoming sessions. All right, so day one questions. We'll just kind of jump right on in here. And again, if you have questions for these raise more questions, please send them into the chat or let your facilitators know, and we can try to answer some questions today, or if we need to circle back during the beginning of our next session to answer some of these. So question one, what are the goals of the DSH funded program? What metrics and outcomes does DSH want to see achieved through these dollars? So first and foremost, we want to see a reduction in the felony IST referrals coming to our hospital system. We have a statutory obligation and to treat the felony IST population, and as everybody knows, we have a major issue with the number of folks who need to get in, who we just don't have capacity for. So one of the goals of this program is to be another way to help reduce that wait list and bring those numbers down. But some other goals of this, some of the other outcomes that we will be tracking, and this is where some of the data collection parts of this program come in, is we do really want to use this program to demonstrate how in the state we can break the cycle of criminalization that these individuals are finding themselves in. So we want to, in broad terms, reduce recidivism, but that can mean a lot of different things, right? So we are going to be looking at things like, well, first of all, like how many people are successfully completing these programs and how many aren't. And after completion of these programs, what happens to them? Do they get rearrested? How often? What types of charges? Is there more time in between arrest dates? Things like that. So we'll be looking at how these programs are working to reduce those rates of recidivism. And I think, Rosemary, would you mind muting yourself? Unfortunately, I can't mute you. And I think you're typing in the background. Thank you.
Oh, yes, thank you. It shows that I've muted, but I'm having some technical difficulties, so I'll sit real still, thanks.
Thank you, Rosemary. Sorry about that. All right, next question. What does a diversion program look like? So our diversion program is diversion from treatment at DSH. That's the first thing I really want to put out there, because I think sometimes there's lots of different types of diversion out there, and it can get the term gets used a lot for lots of different types of programs, and so what you're diverting people from is really important, and this is diversion from treatment at DSH. And what these programs look like are a combination of mental health treatment services and then full wraparound services for this population. So we see a lot of programs that are modeled after or use an assertive community treatment model or a forensic assertive community treatment model. We also see a lot of counties using their full service partnerships as part of this. So that's kind of to give you an idea of the level of services we're talking about for this type of program. And then we also have a requirement that these programs make the connection for these individuals to ongoing care in the community after if they successfully complete the diversion program. The next step is like that warm handoff into the ongoing mental health treatment services in the community. So that's kind of a big picture of what we're looking at here for what a diversion program looks like. And some key components of diversion programs, what really helps make them successful, is a demonstrated collaborative planning with key county partners. So that's really what we're doing here, right? We have asked you to bring all of your key stakeholders to the sessions, and our hope is that you are also going to be meeting outside of these sessions to work together to put these plans together, because it really does take coordination and collaboration between both your behavioral health stakeholders and your criminal justice partners in your community to make a program like this successful. Having a psychopharmacology piece to this program is very important. Housing is very important. Intensive case management, like I mentioned before, assertive community treatment, and then also having some substance abuse treatment options as well. Substance abuse or comorbid FUD is somewhat common with this population. So these are kind of key components that help to create a successful diversion program. Another question we got that's really important is, how does IST or the DSH diversion program differ from broader mental health diversion? So broader mental health diversion is defined in the penal code. It's penal codes 1001.35 and 1001.36. And that's what allows for mental health diversion across the state. And in 1001.36, courts can order somebody with a DSM diagnosis, excluding antisocial personality disorder, borderline personality disorder, and pedophilia. Those are 3 excluded diagnoses. The court can order somebody with a DSM diagnosis, except for those 3, who has either a current felony or a misdemeanor charge, into a diversion treatment program instead of finding them IST or sending them to state hospitals. We do have a handful of charges that are excluded from this program along with the diagnoses. So murder, voluntary manslaughter, rape, and lewd and lascivious acts with a child under the age of 14 are charges that cannot be, if somebody has those charges, they cannot be diverted regardless of the program. So the penal code 101.36 is kind of what we at DSH refer to as like kind of the big bubble, the umbrella legal infrastructure for mental health diversion. We hear a lot of counties refer to this as track 1 diversion. And then our DSH diversion program is actually is a Welfare and Institutions Code 4361 program. So our program is defined in the Welfare and Institutions Code. and it is a subset of the broader mental health diversion law. And as a subset, we have more specific criteria that, that counties have to follow in order to get funding from us for a diversion program. So our funding only supports, first of all, only supports defendants who have a felony charge. They must have a felony charge. That is number one. Number two, they have to have one of 3 diagnoses: schizophrenia, schizoaffective disorder, or bipolar disorder. For our program, those are the 3 that are acceptable. The individuals can be found 1370, so it could be somebody who is already 1370 from your county and is on our pending placement into the state hospital, hasn't been transported yet. It could be somebody that the courts have just found 1370 and the courts can immediately commit them to diversion instead of committing them to DSH. Or it can be an individual with that felony charge that your county feels has the potential to be IST. And we do get a lot of questions about what that means. And really, it's looking at the folks who are on your IST, who have been found IST in your county. Does the person look like that? Is, I think, the best way to think about it. So those are the main differences. So DSH diversion is in Welfare and Institutions Code 4361, so that's what you should be looking at from a statutory perspective when you are thinking about this program. Again, we only do felonies we will only fund felony diversion through our funding program with the specific diagnoses and the other criteria.
Ashley, if I may?
Sure.
Hey, good afternoon, everybody. I'm going to try saying what Ashley just said in a slightly different way in case that helps put the pieces in place. It's possible to think about Department of State Hospital funded diversion as a separate program that has a different target population and different processes. It's also possible to think about Department of State Hospitals funded diversion as a funding stream that can be used to divert certain people in another program that's broader. So that might be another way of thinking about how the penal code and the welfare and institution code pieces come together.
Thank you. Thank you, Hallie. That's helpful. Okay. Some more questions about kind of the legal aspects of this program. So where does this program fit in the legal process? So diversion is a pretrial program. It's pre-plea. And it can be ordered at any point after somebody has been arrested and before they go to trial, basically, or before they are admitted into DSH. So it's in, if you are familiar with the sequential intercept map, it is intercepts like 2 and 3, I believe, on that intercept map. So pre-admission into an institution, pre-trial. The judge's role in diversion, what is the judge's role? So at the most basic level, the judge is the one who's going to make the decision, the ultimate decision as to whether or not somebody can be admitted into or ordered into a diversion program. Basically, diversion is like a conditional release program. There are conditions that are attached to somebody participating in diversion, and so the courts will also be responsible for setting any kind of court monitoring that goes along with that conditional release. I know in a lot of other types of like mental health court and other types of diversion, you typically have times where like a participant has to go in and check in with the court. So the courts would be setting that schedule, and then they would also ultimately be the ones responsible for terminating participation in the program if that's needed. Who initiates the referral? So this is really something that's up to your county. Generally speaking, most counties that we're working with, the referral process is started by the public defender or the defense attorney for the individual. If they're thinking that they may be declaring doubt, that's usually a sign that it might be somebody that you look at for a diversion program. For our diversion program, if they meet those conditions that we talked about, or those criteria that we talked about just a slide ago. And we got the question, does every case referred go through an eligibility hearing? And again, this can really depend on what your county process is, what you set up. So as an example, a number of our counties have established basically like stakeholder groups that are usually made up of their public defender's office, their district attorney's office, the county behavioral health leads for the program, and they get together and they look through the different referrals, and they kind of come to an agreement on who they're going to move forward into the eligibility hearing phase. So that's one way that we see it done, but it's going to be something that is up to your county as you're moving through this planning process. Who would oversee the program? So again, that's going to be up to the county. There's going to be, your county's going to need to really determine that kind of local oversight. The courts do have oversight as well, just in that they are tracking. They're the ones who decide who kind of gets into the program ultimately and if they need to be taken out of the program. DSH, for our part, we have kind of a broad oversight. So we are going to be just tracking your data, tracking your outcomes, and looking at your fiscals after the fact just to make sure that like your county match has been made. But the main oversight of the program is going to be at the local county level. The next question was really interesting and something that I really wanted to make sure that we get some clarity around. So what happens if the diversion program doesn't lead to restoration? So the first thing I want to say is the goal of this program is not competency restoration. That's not what we're trying to do here. At the end of this program, if an individual makes it through their diversion program, their DSH diversion program, and is successful and graduates, their charges are dropped. They don't go to trial. So the point of this is not truly to restore competency to proceed with the trial. It is to, again, break that cycle of criminalization by getting people into long-term mental health treatment. If the defendant, however, does not successfully complete their program, if their participation in this program has to be terminated for whatever reason, then their case will proceed as it normally would. So, and hopefully, I mean, depending, and this can depend, if they've been receiving medication, at least while they were in the diversion program, they may actually not be incompetent at the point that their termination takes place, and they can just proceed with their trial. But that will be, again, something that's determined through the court processes. And I did just get a question in that's along these lines, that if someone needs to be terminated from diversion and they had been on a wait list for DSH, do they go back to jail and wait for a bed at DSH? So it's, again, it depends. Is the person still considered incompetent? If they were never found IST, if you diverted somebody who's likely to be IST, and again, they've been at least stabilized, they've been taking medications perhaps, like it may be that they do go back to jail and then they go on with their trial. If they were pulled from our wait list, we do have a process coming out. It's in internal review right now, but if you are pulling ISTs from our wait list to divert them, they will retain their original commitment date to DSH. So if their diversion participation is terminated, they would be placed back onto the wait list for DSH, but they'd have their original commitment date. So they wouldn't, for lack of a better phrase, they wouldn't lose their place in line, so to speak. I think that the only The only time that that wouldn't be the case is if they're terminated because they've committed a new crime. If they commit a new felony crime and get arrested and that's the cause of their termination, then I think everything just kind of starts over again because they'd have a new IST finding and a new commitment date because of that. So, but there'll be more information about that process coming out hopefully within the next month or two. What are the common pitfalls of diversion? So this is a great question, and I have a pretty simple answer for you all right now, and I think some of this we'll be speaking to today, and some of it will be kind of touched on over the course of the rest of the sessions. But so far, what we are seeing where things aren't working as well, it is because the wrong people are being diverted into the program. There is a lack of communication between the criminal justice and behavioral health stakeholders in the program, and it can be a challenge if you don't have some kind of centralized referral process for the program. So those are kind of the three big ones that we've seen to date. Okay, what is the timeline for this project? So I think you all know that we have a deadline for you to get your program plans into us in December of this year. Our goal is to have contracts executed with all of the counties who continue to move forward by July 1 of 2022, with the goal of having implementation activities beginning in the summer and fall of 2022. That's kind of that is our ideal, that's our goal, that's what we're shooting for. We will, of course, work with each of your counties individually on more specific dates and timelines as we move forward. And final question, what does a program look like that helps with both IST and non-IST participants? So as Hallie had said earlier, this is where you have to start looking at this. This program is a funding stream for a particular population. And so we do have some counties who are working with us who have created kind of one broader mental health diversion program, and they use funding from us to support clients or consumers who meet our criteria in that program, and they've braided that with other funding sources that can help non-IST or non-DSH eligible participants have a spot in the diversion program. So, so that could be, you know, serving people with a felony charge with a diagnosis that doesn't meet our criteria, if that's something that your county wants to do, or serving misdemeanant ISTs, diverting them. So, but it does, our funding has to solely go towards that felony population that meets our criteria, but you can braid the funding and put together, say, a bigger program with other, sorry, Squirrel got distracted at the chat, questions in the chat box. You can braid funding to put together a broader program that can serve more individuals. And so I have another question asking if we can say more about what makes someone a bad fit for diversion per our earlier statement. So that is what we're going to be talking about today. So I think if you just hang with us, that is what we are here today to discuss. Who should be chosen for these programs? What are the characteristics you should be looking for, and how can you find those individuals? So I'm going to put a pin in that question, and maybe we can come back at the end, and if there's still other questions about that, we can tackle it there. So, and that is going to be the end of the Q&A from session 1. And before I hand things over to our partners at DSH, I just want to do a quick scan to see if there are any other issues or questions that people have I don't see anything in the chat box right now, and I don't see any raised hands, so I am going to stop sharing my screen, Katie, so that you can start sharing your slides, and I will hand it on over to you.
Great, thank you. Okay. Yeah. Okay, so my slides are loading, but just as a reminder, I'm Katie Herman. I'm a Senior Policy Analyst here at the Council of State Governments Justice Center. Oops. Something weird happened. Hold on. We'll try that again. So I am Katie from the Council of State Governments Justice Center. I am based in San Francisco. I've been here at the Justice Center about a year and a half. And before coming to the Justice Center, I am a social worker, but I was working in New York City for a diversion program, very similar to what we're doing here in California. It was called the Nathaniel ACT team. So it was an ACT model, intensive outpatient program for people charged with felonies who had serious and persistent mental illness. So I did that for about 8 years. So that was so I do have quite a lot of experience with this population, with this type of program. I've seen it work well from my experience. I've seen some of the challenges, which we'll also talk through. So yeah, I'm just really excited to get this going. Can you see my, can you see my slide?
Yes.
Oh, okay, good. So I am first so happy to introduce one of our special guests, Dr. Deb Heinels, who is the clinical professor of psychiatry and the director of the Psychiatry, Law, and Ethics program at the University of Michigan Medical School. She's going to give us, a broad national and local perspective about competency and diversion. And I mean, as Ashley mentioned at the beginning, she really is if not the national expert on this. So we're so excited to have her. And I will turn it over to Deb now.
Great. And I just want to make sure you can see me and hear me. Can you see me and hear me?
I can hear you.
I can see you, Deb.
Oh, thank you.
Okay, great. And somebody's going to be driving the slides, I think.
Yes, I am.
Okay. So, yes, well, first of all, thank you so much for inviting me back to California. I am obviously not in the state because of COVID, but I have been out there prior to COVID as we looked at, as you guys were rolling out earlier efforts with diversion, and then I've done some virtual work with some of the counties as well, looking at specific cases and trying to problem solve around how can this really work. So I'm really excited to be invited back to help you think about this new source of funding and all of the ways that you might be able to tap into it and really help people on the ground. You know, I come to this with a background of having run forensic services in Massachusetts for 8 years, where I ran, numerous types of diversion programs, police, court-based, reentry, all sorts of different things. And now I'm in Michigan, where I help advise on similar types of programs. So I've been in the shoes of trying to build these programs, and also sort of at the state level trying to look at the landscape and see where the barriers are. So I'm excited to participate with you in this whole Diversion Academy and hear and help problem solve. So let me just start by giving you some of the background that I think is relevant to say, why us, why now? Why are these people, it's great that we got money. Money's always great, but what do we have to do with it, and what's the problem we're trying to solve? And maybe some of this was covered, but I want to just make sure that we're all doing some level setting. We can go to the next slide. I only see the opening.
Oh, wait.
Maybe they see something different.
I don't, oh, hold on. Hold on. Uh-oh. What? Okay, let me close it. Do you see like the slide with a pie chart?
No.
Uh-oh. Hold on one second.
I see DSH Diversion Academy Day 2.
Yes,
No, we love this technology when it works.
do you see now?
I do a lot of
different.
Not really. Now is when I say this is when we do a mindfulness exercise, and everyone should just take advantage of this.
Yeah,
do the deep breathing.
Thank you, Dr. Pinels.
Ignore Katie and just focus on your breathing.
Please.
There you go. Okay.
Oh,
perfect.
okay.
Now we got it. See, as soon as you look away, as soon as you look, we're
Magic.
So, yes, it's really good. I seriously do a lot of talks on mindfulness these days, and I think we all need them, including me.
Thank you.
So, all right. So basically, what are we talking about? Evaluation and restoration. And as you heard, this is not a restoration program. This is a diversion program. But something that's happening around the country is that there are headlines. In fact, I teach at the University of Michigan Law School, and I always ask them to pull out articles that are of relevance to law and psychiatry. And invariably, they're pulling out articles from around the country on this particular issue, not necessarily for California, but you could pull it out in a lot of different jurisdictions, that we have this population of people who get charged and then who get routed through the pathway of the competency system, where there's waits for evaluations, waits for beds, because that's traditionally where they've been placed for restoration services. And then you get to the end of the road if you follow a lot of these individuals and you realize this is not somebody that the court really had an interest in trying to begin with, but the competency route was kind of the default route. So this is getting a lot of headlines. It's also getting a lot of litigation. You know, and in the spirit of full disclosure, I do serve as an expert for the court monitor in the state of Washington, where there's been a lot of press about the case in Washington related to this issue. And lots of different things have been done to try and build out new places, more places for restoration to occur. But I think the real heart of the matter is thinking about diversion as the solution to just try and have only those people who need competency services to be placed in that pathway. Next slide. So this is just a depiction that comes from NASHBID and the NASHBID Research Institute that shows that people across the country are waiting days and days and days, sometimes months, and in some cases more than a year, to access inpatient services once their competency has been raised. Next slide. And this is a slide looking in a different direction at the same problem, which is that if you look at state hospital populations around the United States, the percentage of people that are occupying beds because of a finding of incompetence to stand trial has increased. The most important is most important number really is the bar graph is the right, is looking at the average for the country, which shows that over 50 to 60% increase in the incompetent to stand trial population. Now you could say, well, that's because civil beds closed, so the percentage of ISTs went up. And, you know, that may be one factor, but that is not what explains this whole factor. There's just a lot of things that we don't all fully understand in terms of what is driving the seemingly ever increase in orders for competency evaluations and then competency restoration. Next slide. The process is also complex, and like I said, there are waits along the pathway. So this is something that sometimes I use the analogy of chutes and ladders, except for the fact that chutes and ladders is kind of a fun game when you're a kid. It's a little frustrating when you have to fall back down the chute and go back to the beginning. But for somebody that's in the competency system, there's obviously, it's not fun and it's a pretty serious matter. And so what ends up happening is you have people that get identified as having a competency issue. They may be found incompetent to stand trial. They may be committed for restoration. They may have to wait for a state hospital bed. They may get admitted to the state hospital bed When they appear competent, they may get discharged, returned to jail, not to a community-based setting, and only to relapse on their, because their medications aren't consistent or the jail environment isn't conducive for ongoing recovery, and then they come back to court and the competency issue is raised again. And there's just this cycle that goes on, and we're seeing around the country that people who are in the competency system or at risk of being in the competency system have revolved through this cycle multiple times, and without real resolution of the charges and without real attachment to programs and services that help keep them out of the criminal legal system. Next slide. So this raises a lot of questions about why is, as I said, there's many factors about why this is happening that aren't explainable. But one of the things that we know is that the Supreme Court even, has really emphasized the critical importance of competence to stand trial. Every case that's come before the Supreme Court has made a point of saying that if there's a doubt about somebody's competency, it must be raised. Once the competency issue is raised, generally speaking, it puts that forensic pathway in play. And what happens, ironically, is these other programs that communities have built out for, quote, mental health diversion become unavailable to individuals for whom competency is raised. And so you could almost make the argument that if competency to stand trial is raised for some of our sickest individuals in the criminal system, those with significant cognitive challenge due to psychosis or intellectual disability or traumatic brain injury, if they are some of the most impaired people that we see, why would they be the least eligible for diversion? And why would they get routed into this forensic route that keeps them in holding patterns without any resolution or ability to connect them to longer-term services? And so this becomes part of the problem, is that this historic pathway and the emphasis on the critical importance of competence become competing kind of pressures into the system. And so what has happened historically is that all the parties have justifiably and legally turned the matter over to another entity to deal with the issue. So an individual who goes into the forensic system then is caught up in all the processes that are required for forensic people, but then and the prosecutor's happy because they're in a locked setting, the defense attorney's happy because it'll count as time served, the judge is happy because their time clock for speedy trials is put in abeyance because the competency issue has to be resolved because you can't try an incompetent defendant. But everybody sort of feels like this has gone well, except for the individual who's kind of stuck, or their family members who are saying, what's going to happen to my loved one? And, how do they get advocated for? And so there's a lot of challenges that are going on now around the country where a lot of the states are trying to build up these diversion options to try and find better pathways for people. And it really goes back to a phrase that I adopted in a juvenile detention alternative. It's sort of basically diversion for juveniles, if you will, sort of a parallel process of getting people in the right door at the right time for the right reason is really why we're here, and why you're here to try and create that right door for the right reason. Next slide. We know that in the environment that people live in, whether it's in the community or even once they're hospitalized, or if they're incarcerated or held in jail, there are many environmental challenges that can lead to destabilization. I can't tell you how many cases I've consulted on over my career where an individual, unravels in some setting after being stable in another setting. I don't have to tell you that, you all know that. There's also this challenge of utilization management that it's really not monitored as much in forensic processes, again, because of some of the legal rules of people needing to go through that criminal pathway. There's also challenges where we have evaluators evaluating competence to stand trial, but that may not be, they may have differences of opinion, so there may be contested cases. There also may not be consensus on reliable opinions about, even if you have a diversion program, who would be eligible? So that's why we're going to talk about who's eligible in this diversion program. And then, you know, different states have different rules around reevaluations of competence to stand trial and how frequent that needs to happen before people kind of get lost in this just based on a judge's clock, you know, a criminal clock rather than a treatment need clock. Next slide. We go to the next slide. I'm not seeing the next slide, Katie. Can you guys hear me?
I can hear you. Oh, there we go.
Okay, thanks. All right, so what's happening across the country is really moving this idea, and there's Olmstead and Americans with Disability Act arguments that should be made in this context that haven't really gotten to national attention yet in terms of other laws, except for maybe in a couple of states. But the idea is we don't want people living in institutions, and for a lot of reasons, one of them being the Americans with Disabilities Act, which says that people with disabilities really shouldn't be hospitalized if they don't need to be hospitalized, or institutionalized for that matter. And we are all in favor of community inclusion. You know, from a DEI lens and other things, we really need to think about moving systems from institutions to communities and really supporting people, again, so that people who need a hospital or people who need jail for whatever public safety interest is in that jail are there, but those who can be managed and supported and successful in the community really are supported successfully in the community. That is really a tenet that that's an important one in our society. Next slide. Even the American Bar Association adopted this, whereas for years there's always this worry that for a defense attorney to not raise the competency question, there might be accused of ineffective assistance of counsel. The American Bar Association in 2016 updated their standards that allowed incompetent defendants charged with at least minor crimes to be released or civilly committed, and that there should be alternatives to hospital restoration, diversion opportunities offered even for defendants that might be incompetent to stand trial. And that was a great way of telling the lawyers, like, there's other alternatives that could be used here that would be that would really be within the standards of good lawyering. Next slide. There's many states that are adopting community-based restoration programs. Again, this diversion program is not a restoration program, but I will say that that is happening around the country at a fast clip. Next slide. There are states that are doing jail-based restoration, and California is one of those states that does jail-based restoration. Again, that's fine for people who need that type of service. The community-based restoration, obviously ideal, if people need that type of service. If they don't need that type of service, then we don't want to have them in that. We want to help support people in the community and get them routed out of the criminal system. Next slide. So is diversion an option? It's really a matter of going upstream, really thinking about upstream, again, thinking about these as individuals who may have significant impairments, who for a variety of reasons may have gotten into the criminal system that didn't really mean that they needed to be in the criminal system. And when we think about the purpose of our criminal legal system, we're really not serving our purpose if we're not using it in the right way that it was intended for. Next slide. So a lot of states are looking at policy changes on misdemeanors, getting people charged with misdemeanors out of the competency pathway altogether. New York, for example, has a civil commitment route for people who are charged with misdemeanors rather than sending them through traditional competency processes. There's lots of ways of people looking at release provisions for community restoration, as I said, and then states like California leading the charge on these diversion strategies that many states are watching to see how you all can succeed and show how these programs can work, which is super exciting. Next slide. We did a peer learning collaborative. As I said, I sit in Michigan. In 2017, we pulled together our neighboring states, and we learned a lot about how everybody was working to help develop strategies to decrease the trend of people going into the competency system. And through some pretty significant efforts, I think each state has made some real inroads into their competency wait lists. Next slide. And from there, SAMHSA picked up that idea of the peer learning collaborative, and through the GAIN Center that works, in collaboration with CSG from 2018 to 2021, there were several states that engaged in communities of practice looking at competence to stand trial and competency restoration, California being one of them. So kudos to California for doing that work and for continuing to do this in this way. Next slide. Looking at the sequential intercept model, which hopefully you're all familiar with, and if you're not, I've provided the citation, and you can just Google it. There's lots of information about it. This is codified into federal law. It was in the 21st Century Cures Act, and essentially what it is a premise that says that we can use intercept points to identify people who can be routed out of the criminal system and support them to reduce the penetration of those individuals with mental illness, substance use disorders, and intellectual disabilities, traumatic brain injury, even dementia. Whatever the condition is, we can move them out of the criminal system if that is not where they need to be. Next slide. And we've modified that through this other pictorial diagram to show that there's real diversion opportunities that can be used at every step along the way. And I think what we're going to be talking about is at the point the CST is raised or prior to that, at various points in that very nuanced area for those individuals at risk of being incompetent to stand trial. How do we move them out of the forensic system, out of the criminal system, and into support into their communities in a safe way without compromising anybody's, any public safety issue? Next slide. And these are just strategies that we wrote about in a paper, my colleague Lisa Callahan and I, really looking at ways that programs that you're going to be coming up with your own models that really look at, linkages to services for unique populations, competency dockets, however it's going to work in your community around building out programs that can help divert people out of the competency system and really keep them out of the criminal legal system altogether so that over time their charges can be disposed of in a different way. Next slide. It's really important to think about the population that we're addressing as a way of looking at, again, these are individuals with some type of mental health condition broadly defined. It might be serious mental illness, bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, schizoaffective disorder. That's probably the most common. And then you get a whole host of other types of conditions that lead to these, that lead to this pathway into the system that we're trying to reroute. But it's really important that as you think about this, that each of these individual cases needs individualized solutions. So for example, somebody with persistent psychosis who's also a methamphetamine user, well, we have to think about a program that's going to help them with both their mental illness as well as their substance use. We also want to make sure that in thinking about a program for services is that risks cannot just be assumed. You can have a person with a low-level charge, trespassing, who presents significant risk because maybe they had a history of something serious in their background, or maybe they're actually right now delusional and having ideas of harming somebody, but they have a low-level charge and they were found trespassing in the church. Then again, you can have somebody with a higher level of charge, like an assault and battery. This is a pretty common one, assault and battery on a peace officer or a public official. Well, when you really, or we just looked at one case in Michigan of a guy who, ended up in a high-speed chase down a highway. But if you really look at the background of that person, there was almost no issue, that it was like a situation that got escalated in the moment, and really they're not a high risk. It was just something that ended up in a bad outcome. So risk cannot just be assumed. It really has to be assessed both clinically, from a criminogenic perspective, you have to look at both factors to develop that individualized treatment plan. Also, individual needs shift just as life evolves. Look at ourselves in COVID. Our needs are shifting constantly, so we can't expect people with these conditions to have static needs. And so the system has to be nimble to be able to address those needs as they go so that we can create plans for stability as well as plans for when things go awry, because surely the way life works, things go awry for all of us. People go off their medicine. I don't stay on my antibiotics. It's hard to stay on antipsychotics. I mean, we have these challenges, and so we really have to have these systems that are dedicated to this population, where funding comes in to pay for the services, which you in California are lucky with this funding. You have a funding mechanism to do this, and you really want to think about the rights of individuals with disabilities and think about the Americans with Disabilities Act even as a change catalyst to help drive some of this for you, because there is the potential for litigation ongoing in that regard too, where we don't want people institutionalized if that is not what is appropriate for them due to their disability. So we really have to think about how do we keep people living in an included way. I didn't bring up the issue of race and ethnicity. That's a huge issue too. We know there's disparities. That has to be addressed so that there's equity in these diversion programs as well. And I apologize because I should have had a line item for that because it's so important. Next slide. So who is appropriate for diversion is really what we want to think about. And remember, people might be appropriate for diversion, but they may have an illness, like if they have diabetes, where their diabetes gets out of control and they need to get their sugar checked. They may be appropriate for diversion, but they may also have a relapse of their symptoms which needs more clinical attention. But that's okay. You have to bake that into your diversion program so that you understand the nature of the condition and plan for when there might be relapses. Next slide. So the clinical criteria in this program, you know, diagnoses of schizophrenia, schizoaffective disorder, bipolar disorder, defendants who do not pose unreasonable risk if treated out in the community, histories of multiple psychiatric hospitalizations, who have multiple ER visits. In some states, they're looking at AOT orders, these assisted outpatient treatment orders, people who've had a history of injectable antipsychotic medications. I mean, these might be clinical criteria to think about who might be eligible. You're on mute, Katie.
Oh, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, so we actually formally finished your presentation, the last slide before this. This is excellent. And we'll have more of a conversation as I go through these slides, but are there any questions or comments for Deb about what she just went through, which was so amazing, before we keep going? I didn't want you to feel like you had to talk through all of my slides, so I wanted to make sure I stopped you for a second.
No, I appreciate that. I think we've talked so much that I actually lost track of which ones were mine. So I certainly don't mean to talk through yours. But basically, these are the things that we're going to need to think about. And hopefully, this academy is a way to really get charged up, to really think, really no pun intended, but to really think about your role as being really national leaders in problem solving for something that we're seeing and really need to tackle. So very excited to be here. Thank you, Katie. You can take over from here.
Oh, thank you, Deb. So yeah, as Ashley, mentioned at the beginning, really the key to this program is getting the right participants. That's how we're really going to see success. And this program does have, these specific diagnostic criteria, which we'll talk about a bit more in a second. The defendant cannot pose an unreasonable risk if treated in the community. We're also going to talk about what that means a bit later when we have Sarah Demaray with us. And some other things that if you're a defense attorney, if you are from behavioral health, if you're a judge, a district attorney, and you have, a case in front of you, you're trying to decide, is this a good fit for this DSH diversion? And you have access to psychiatric records, ideally. If you see a history of many psychiatric hospitalizations, either many like ER visits for psychiatric issues or inpatient admissions, people that have histories of AOT orders, or people that may have had histories of injectable antipsychotics. This doesn't mean that just having these things in your records means you're eligible for diversion, but things to kind of be looking out for. You know, if you don't have access to records, and if you're the person interviewing a potential participant, you know, asking about these things. Have you ever been psychiatrically hospitalized? How many times? Did you go to the hospital voluntarily? Did you go in an ambulance? You know, have you ever had a judge tell you that you had to take medication? Did you ever get, you know, medication by an injection, maybe outside of like an ER setting, to kind of help you get a sense, like, is this someone whose illness is so severe that they would need this type of diversion? And just as a reminder, and kind of make it concrete again, for this IST diversion program, the 3 diagnoses that are eligible are schizophrenia, schizoaffective disorder, and bipolar disorder, which are serious and persistent mental illnesses. But there are other serious mental illnesses like PTSD and major depressive disorder. You know, there's major depressive disorder with psychotic features or things, which while those are serious mental illnesses, those are not eligible for this DSH diversion program. And I wonder, Ashley, if you want to talk just a bit about why these 3 are the only eligible diagnoses for this program?
Sure, not a problem. Let me turn my camera back on so you can see me. And this goes back to some of what Dr. Warburton presented during our last session. She talked a lot about the research that was done specifically into the DSH IST population. That was research that was conducted by DSH in partnership with University of California at Davis. And what they found was that the majority of the ISTs that were being admitted into our program really had, in particular, schizophrenia and schizoaffective disorder. Bipolar disorder, I believe, was kind of third or second-ish. I know the DSM has changed, so how you define some of these things kind of has changed a little bit. But so that was the number one reason. This is a large percentage, perhaps the largest percentage of ISTs that are coming into our system. These are the diagnoses that they have. The other reason is because these diagnoses, for the most part, in most cases, are very treatable with medication, which is very important for this, because if these folks are getting arrested and ending up in the justice system because of the symptoms of their mental illness, and those symptoms can most readily be, oh gosh, I can't find the right word. I keep wanting to say controlled, and I don't think that's the right word to use, but mitigated perhaps is a better word with medication. So I think those were kind of key reasons why these particular diagnoses were selected.
Thank you, Ashley. So again, as we talked about before, you can divert people with PTSD, people with major depressive disorder, people with other mental health needs, just not using this DSH funding. I feel like I hear a little feedback or something, but I'm just going to keep going. So again, if you're looking at a case file in front of you, either as an attorney, a behavioral health provider, a judge, what are some types of charges that may raise a flag for you? This person may be eligible for this DSH diversion. These are based on things that I saw frequently when I was working for a diversion program in New York City. So looking for assaults that occur in hospital settings, either like an ER or an inpatient psychiatric unit. I'm sorry, Sarah Demeray, you may not be muted, and that might be causing that weird sound. Oh, good, it's done. Okay. So again, this doesn't mean that people that commit these types of charges have a serious mental illness or that they are good diversion participants. These are just things that may raise some flags in your head. Assaults that are happening in hospitals, and some people are so psychotic, so unwell while they're in a hospital that they assault staff or another patient. Sometimes it can be quite badly, but that's something that might flag, because if they've gotten to the point where they are in an inpatient psychiatric unit, they're probably quite unwell at the time of their instant offense. Arson, I think Sarah might talk a bit more about arson. Again, not saying that everyone who commits arson has a serious mental illness or is a diversion eligible person, but it does seem like many cases of arson are committed by people with mental health issues. You know, there's also, I think, a spectrum of arson. There's, you know, very severe arson where a building is burnt down or a giant wildfire started, or there's more, I mean, arson is very serious, but more minor arson where someone may set a fire in a trash can because they're living on the streets and they want to keep warm. Or I had a client who went into a bank and set some bank deposit slips on fire for some unknown reason, but, you know, they were able to put it out. Yes, it's very serious. Yes, there needs to be a response to that type of behavior, but it's not, you know, I would say the same as someone burning down a house. Bank robberies, in that case, I'm thinking more about people that go in and like pass a note that may be, these are cases I've seen, you know, kind of psychotic in nature, delusional, and ask for money. They may say they have a weapon. They may, like, you know, hold their hand under their shirt to make it look like they have a gun. They may come in and have like a stick or something, which they then charge, the police may charge as a weapon. So, you know, not kind of like high level sophisticated bank robberies, but we would have a lot of cases like that when I was working in New York, people trying to rob a bank. Terroristic threats, we had a lot of cases also of people like using a pay phone to call in to like the police headquarters and make threats. We had one man who called in and said, you know, I have a police commissioner in the back of my car and I'm going to drive off a bridge, and, you know, he's calling for a pay phone. He did not have, that was not going on, but he was very delusional, very psychotic. You know, yeah, making threats usually over the phone about, you know, politicians are saying, not to say these are not serious cases that should be taken seriously, but I saw a lot of cases like that that were connected to some kind of delusion. Harassment, like if someone has, in New York we call them orders of protection, like a restraining order against someone, and it's being violated like repeatedly, and it doesn't seem like the person really understands what the order of protection is or what it's for. It could be, you know, against someone they know or like a public figure. We had a client who, I guess I can say because it's not HIPAA information, but she had a very preoccupation with Robin Roberts from Good Morning America, and she would go to the set of Good Morning America, you know, it's like outside every day, and then like a horrible incident occurred at the Good Morning America station. So Robin Roberts had an order of protection against our client. So things like that, if you see like a well-known person that has an order of protection against a client that you're potentially working with. I don't know if there's others that people maybe are thinking about, they want to put in the chat, or if Sarah or Deb, if you have thoughts about other types of charges that you typically would see for people that are charged, or for people that are being considered for diversion.
Hi, this is Sarah, hopefully appropriately unmuted now. Sorry, all. I was just going to add that a lot of what we would see also was the escalation of charges. within the context of interactions with law enforcement or other helpers. So it wasn't just about escalation within the hospital context, but also more generally, something that would start out, and one of the ways that we would look for this is if there was a very low level crime included in the charged offenses, and then also a more serious felony assault. So that's one of the ways that we would flag for it.
You know, again, and these are things based on my experiences, you know, if you see charges that are kind of rare, I guess I'll say, we had a client who was charged with cemetery desecration, which is a crime, and it was a very sad case where he was extremely delusional. He thought that he was digging up the grave of his mother, who was still alive, and it was very sad, but that is a felony in New York, so he was indicted for cemetery desecration. You know, so things like that might raise some flags. Also, you know, if you're thinking in your community, if there's like certain places that maybe people with mental illness are known to like congregate or something. For example, in New York, we had quite a few people who were arrested for going to the Metropolitan Museum of Art and defacing a painting. Different people in different situations. It's not funny, it's very serious, but people would, we had one client who thought if he like etched something into one of the paintings that it would unite all of the world's religions. He was very delusional, he was very psychotic. While he was doing that, you know, he got into an argument with the security guard, ended up like in a physical assault, and because the security guard was considered, you know, on duty, that bumped up the charges because the painting cost so much money, like that bumped up the charges. So, you know, if you're thinking about places in your community that may like attract certain maybe odd behaviors, just kind of a weird question, but might just be something. So if you're looking at a case and you see like, oh, look, this happened at the Met Museum, for example, that might flag like, that's, you know, something to look into further. And please, if anyone wants to, you know, put anything in the chat or raise their hand, or if any of our panelists want to jump in, please do. So this is again talking about how do we engage potential diversion participants to assess their eligibility for this program. Obviously, a records review is really important. Ideally, getting a client to sign a consent form so that you can get previous hospital records, previous outpatient treatment records, reviewing their jail mental health records if they have past state hospital hospitalizations, trying to get access to those records. Review of their past criminal history, of course, is very important through their rap sheet. An interview, if you're given consent, with the client's family or other collateral contacts to get a sense of what their mental health history and treatment history has been like. And then, of course, an interview with the participant. But of course, ideally not solely basing your assessment for diversion eligibility on, you know, one interview with someone. It's possible to have more sources of information. And again, I kind of talked about this already, but what types of questions can you ask to try to get a sense of whether someone's a good candidate for diversion? You know, of course, asking about their past treatment history, specifically things like past hospitalizations, you know, past medication, especially injectable medication. Have they been on AOT? You know, trying to get a sense of their insight into their mental illness, although having insight isn't a requirement to participate in DSH diversion, but that might be a different conversation. You know, asking about substance use, trying to get a sense of, you know, during their incident offense, were they under the influence of drugs or alcohol? Those are just some things to be thinking about when you're determining if someone is a good fit. Oh, good. So now we're going to talk through some hypothetical case studies who are, you know, very much based on people I've really worked with in New York, and we'll have a group discussion with our panelists about these cases and whether we think they're good, unlike people are good, appropriate for fit for diversion. And then we're going to have a break, and then we're going to come back, and you'll talk about a different case study in your group about if they're a good candidate for diversion and what they would need to have in place if they were going to be released to diversion. So you should have all received this as an attachment, I hope, from Ashley. It's quite small, but I'll just read it very quickly. So this is the case. Jim Taylor is a 42-year-old white, single, unemployed, domiciled man who was arrested in Santa Clara County in 2019 and charged with felony burglary. According to the arrest complaint, Jim entered a graduate student's apartment while the student was sleeping. The complainant reported accidentally leaving her apartment door unlocked before going to sleep that night. When she woke up, she found Jim standing in her kitchen rifling through her backpack. He told the student he was not there to hurt her, but that he was, quote, looking for something. He presented as very disorganized and psychotic, but was not aggressive, agitated, or threatening. The complainant called the police, and Jim calmly waited in the building until the police arrived. At his arraignment, Jim's disorganized thought process and negative symptoms made it very difficult for his defense attorney to understand Jim's explanation of what led to his arrest. This was Jim's first and only arrest or contact with the criminal justice system. Upon admission to local jail, he continued to present with disorganized thinking and speech, along with the negative symptoms such as flat affect. However, jail staff were able to engage him, and while withdrawn, he was overall pleasant, polite, and cooperative with staff and attended some of the unit's group treatment sessions. In the jail, he was diagnosed with schizophrenia and prescribed an injectable antipsychotic medication. While he continued to express very limited insight into his mental illness, he was able to understand that the medications were beneficial to him and that continuing to take medication would be an important aspect of his discharge plan. Jim lived with his parents and sister his entire life. His family was very supportive and involved in his care, but struggled to help him stay engaged in outpatient mental health treatment prior to his arrest. They had referred him to a private psychiatrist in their neighborhood whom he met with about once every 3 months, but he was not compliant with his medication, and his family struggled to closely monitor his medications due to their work schedules. Jim has been psychiatrically hospitalized about 5 times since being diagnosed with schizophrenia in his late teens. He had no history of substance use or abuse. Prior to his arrest, Jim mostly stayed home by himself during the day listening to music or helping break down boxes at a local gas station. His family is willing to have Jim live with them again if he is released from jail. So thinking about this case, is this someone who's appropriate for diversion? What treatment and support would need to be in place if you were considering a case like this? And I'll first open it up to Sarah Desmarais to get your thoughts about a case like this.
Sorry, I have a slow connection, so I think I'm on. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah, so for me here, one of the considerations is thinking about compliance with medication and how to monitor the medications and the number of times he's been through. The family is willing to have Jim live with them again, and so thinking through the plan and the community. But generally speaking, we're seeing, somebody who has some pretty clear psychiatric issues that can be managed with the medication. And those are the things that kind of jump out to me. When he's in the community, the issue will be really about the level of supervision and intervention, right? So one of the things that we would think about is, and I'm going to talk about a little bit later, is thinking through the level of kind of contact, the level and degree and intensity of what might be available in whatever community it is that he would be going back to. So those are off the top of my head what I would be thinking through, thinking about this person for diversion.
Great. Deb, do you have thoughts about a case like this, given your experiences, if he would be an appropriate fit for this type of DSH diversion? We can come back to Deb, because if you're speaking, we can't hear you. But I'll know, ask Sean Evans from DSH. I mean, what do you think about a case like this? Sean, in terms of his eligibility for diversion based on some of the cases that you've seen and worked with through this program?
Yeah, I think echoing the comments that Sarah's made, there's a lot of aspects to Jim that I think make him a really strong candidate for diversion. I go back to those criteria, his IST status, his specific SMI diagnosis, the symptoms being connected to his charged offense, and his, not posing an unreasonable risk of threat to the community. Sometimes when I think about these cases, I sort of think of it in sort of three categories, sort of like, yes, strong candidate, no, not a strong candidate, and then there's kind of the maybe it depends. And I think Jim is a great example of like a really strong, good candidate. From a risk perspective, no history of violence or past arrest. He does have a history of severe mental illness, but he's willing to take medications. He has no substance abuse history, so that's like a whole sort of complexity that we can sort of not worry about as much with him. He's got great support from his family. And I would even say, though he has limited insight, he's engaging in treatment. So even though he may not have sort of the cognitive awareness, he's behaviorally doing the thing that you want him to be doing. So I think Jim, in my mind, is a really strong candidate for diversion, given what we know. And I don't know if there's any other DSH panelists out there who'd like to contribute or add, but that's sort of my take on it.
Great. Yeah, I think all those points are so important. Definitely he'll need some kind of intensive outpatient treatment, potentially an ACT team, or at least some kind of, very intensive case management portion to ensure he's compliant with his treatment. He's currently taking an injectable medication in the jail, which, as we talked about, is a really great sign. So, the importance of being able to continue that injection when he gets out to ensure his medication compliance. Also, in terms of services, his family may need some psychoeducation and Jim around the symptoms of his illness, warning signs when he may be recompensating, because it sounds like, before he was arrested, they were kind of missing some of those signs. He wasn't compliant with his medication, so, that might be a part of his treatment, if possible, engaging the family around some psychoeducation. And also, a diversion program would hopefully help get him involved in some pro-social activities. While he is low risk in terms of his criminal history, he does not have a lot of pro-social activity that he's involved in, so that could probably help his stability and just help his quality of life. So that's something I think a diversion program could also think about when developing his treatment plan. So any other thoughts about Jim from any of the panelists before we move on?
Yeah, I think what you said, Katie, is spot on, and Sean. I think, this is just a pretty classic individual who, but for the criminal charges, might be an ACT team eligible person, and so thinking about that as a model where there's wraparound supports, I think it looks like he's pleasant, he's cooperative. There's aspects of his personality that are not as antisocial and probably easier to engage in some ways, as long as he's got his psychosis under control. I'd want to understand what he thinks about his illness, what his views are of managing his illness, to really try and maximize that that engagement piece, as well as, how is the team going to work with his prescriber? Who's on the team? If it's an ACT team, then the prescriber's on the team. But if it's not an ACT team, if it's another type of diversion program, oftentimes we see this disconnect between the prescriber's observations and the staff's observations. So I would want to make sure that you have a way of, communicating across the aisle to make sure everybody's kind of seeing the same thing helping him, you know, achieve some goals that he might have for himself, which we don't fully know from this vignette.
If I can add one more thing that came up when Deb, you were talking, it would be about also just working with the family so that they can be aware of what some signs are to look for. And I think with that, in combined with some of like an ACT team or some other kind of community treatment, I think we'd be in a really good place to also catch any relapse early, so that, you know, there could be very swift risk management if needed.
Absolutely. All right, good. So now we're going to move on to talking about Lisa. So I'll just read this quickly. Lisa Perez is a 40-year-old single, unemployed, homeless Hispanic woman. She has one adult son whom she was in minimal contact with prior to her incarceration. Lisa was arrested in Sacramento in 2019 and charged with felony arson and criminal mischief. According to the arrest complaint, she entered a Walgreens, poured lighter fluid around her in a circle, and swung a lit cigarette lighter in the air while threatening to set a fire. She also shouted that she was being followed by demons and that setting herself on fire was the only way for the demons to stop chasing her. The lighter fluid did not ignite, and there were no injuries reported at the scene. Witnesses and the police who responded to the incident reported that Lisa presented as agitated, delusional, and disorganized. A review of Lisa's mental health records indicated an inconsistent history of community mental health treatment prior to her arrest and incarceration for her instant offense. She was diagnosed with schizoaffective disorder in her early 20s and had multiple psychiatric hospitalizations after that, most recently 2 months prior to her arrest. She was referred to various outpatient mental health clinics following her hospitalizations, but she did not fully engage in services at these clinics. She has a history of crack cocaine and marijuana use in her early 20s. Her records indicate that she has continued to use marijuana occasionally for the last 20 years, but has remained abstinent from cocaine for the last 15 years. She is homeless and living in a shelter at the time of her arrest for her instant offense and does not engage in any mental health services. Lisa has one prior conviction for felony assault from 2015. In that case, Lisa was attempting to enter the family court building and was asked to pass through the building's metal detector by the security staff. Lisa refused to move or walk through the metal detector, and when a security officer approached her, she bit the officer's arm. Other officers intervened, and she bit the other officers as well. A competency evaluation was ordered after that arrest, and she was found incompetent to stand trial. She was referred to the state hospital, where she initially presented as psychotic, combative towards staff and other patients, and required stat medication injections on 2 occasions due to her agitation. Hospital staff received an involuntary medication order for Lisa, which was granted, and she was stabilized after being placed on injectable antipsychotic medication in addition to an oral mood stabilizer. Lisa was found fit to proceed after a 4-month state hospitalization and returned to jail. She pled guilty to that charge and was sentenced to 2 years prison. So this case, you know, it's complicated. There's a lot going on. But, you know, I'll start with Sarah. What are your thoughts about whether Lisa would be an appropriate candidate for this type of diversion program? Yeah, I'll first start with that.
Sure. So there's a couple of points that I want to make kind of off the beginning with her case. The first is that this is a very specific arson situation. And I know that folks are very, arson is serious or can be, and it's kind of a scary charging offense. And so as you mentioned, this is something that I want to come back to as well. So something that we know about arson is that it actually has an incredibly low recidivism rate, right? It's one of the crimes for which we actually see the lowest repeating offenses in that way. So that's one thing. And the other thing related to the arson here is that it seems very clearly connected with the psychotic symptoms. So it doesn't seem that this was fire starting or fire setting with the intent of something other than addressing an issue stemming from the psychotic disorder. And we would be more concerned about recidivism in the case of arson if there was something more about the arson itself that the individual enjoyed or found motivating. So I wanted to put that there. I'm thinking in my head of Sean's comments about easier and more complicated cases. And so this is one that is definitely going to be more complicated. And the things that we would want to think about here is really, and I'll be interested to hear what others, Sean and Deb, think about this around the role that the mental illness is playing in combination with the substance use. And that's the piece that is going to be important, is to consider when we're thinking about, again, risk mitigation in the community, what are the substance use interventions available to, in addition to what would need to be in place for strictly, mental health focused work. So those are the kind of 2 or 3 issues I wanted to highlight as I was listening to you walk through the case.
Thank you. And Deb, what do you think about a case like this for diversion based on your experience and what the research might indicate, given all these different factors?
Yeah, I think Sarah was like spot on to what I would be saying as well. The arson is always going to be scary for people. There should be an analysis of whether there have been other fire setting episodes. We can't tell from this vignette. We're assuming that there was just this one related to psychosis, so presumably if you're treating the psychosis, you're mitigating the risk against the arson. But there might be ways to help mitigate risk further by developing plans to have her not have lighters and really, that can be complicated. Sometimes you need a conservator to help with some of that. You sort of need a team approach to mitigate that fire setting risk. You might want to have her in housing that has additional sprinkler systems. These are the things we've thought about in cases that I've worked on like this, where you really want to get drilled down so people feel more comfortable with her in a community-based setting. Again, I think the substance use is big. If she's using crack cocaine, is she making her own crack? That's another fire setting risk. So, and is she actively using? We don't have medicines to treat crack cocaine. Marijuana can this is the kind of person where marijuana itself can activate with those kinds of drugs and psychosis. Marijuana can be activating. So we want to mitigate that by potentially doing toxicology screens along the way and helping work with her around recovery from substance use as well. See if there's other substances that she's getting involved in. I don't know about her trauma history and her, how her social determinants play a role. All we know is she's unemployed, homeless, and Latina. I'd like to understand a little bit more about her trauma history, and so that any treatment that we give would be very trauma informed. Finally, her medications, sounds like she's stabilized on long-acting injectables with a mood stabilizer. And so, is that a medicine that really still works for her? Has she had breakthrough symptoms? Was it dosed appropriately? Was she having side effects? What was the mood stabilizer? What's the process for checking on that? And again, I would say the prescriber and the team need to be working together. Sometimes I think the treatment plan, we focus so much on the patient as the treatment, the identified individual, Lisa, for the treatment plan. But what we forget is that part of the treatment plan has to be how much are the treatment providers going to connect together. Like, you have to make an active plan. And so I use a scale, sort of a grid that really comes from some of the work with CSG, but really looking at, if this is somebody that's got high risk and high needs, then the treatment planning folks need to be talking about her regularly. Part of the diversion plan has to be that we all have to have our eyes on the ball. She has challenges, so it's our job to wrap around her, and that means we have to be talking to each other so that we know what's going on with her, and that will help calm everybody down and mitigate the risk. You don't want 2 weeks to go by where nobody talked to anybody, she slips through the cracks, and next thing you know, there's something else going on. So part of the diversion plan has to be, how does the system work together deliberately and intentionally.
Absolutely, those are such good points. And Sean, I mean, what are your thoughts about a case like this for, DSH diversion?
Yeah, so I just want to echo everything that both Deb and Sarah said. I think the both of you are totally spot on, and I totally agree with your comments. The only sort of two things, so I guess going back to that basic question, I think it is one of these more complex cases, and I think Lisa in a lot of ways is probably someone more typical who will encounter with these sorts of decisions where there is a lot of complexity. And I think the points about the substance use are right on point. One thing I was just going to add is, you were talking earlier, Katie, about like doing the clinical interviews and getting good information. I think it's always good when substance use, specifically with cannabis or cocaine or methamphetamines, is sort of at use, is to as much as one can get this information, but to try to determine sort of the connection of symptoms with whether the person is intoxicated on a substance or going through withdrawals. So, with someone like Lisa, maybe she went through a long period of pretty consistent, cannabis use, and then the day before or 2 days before she stopped using, that in itself could be a trigger. So just to kind of get, I guess, granular about, I think, the importance of looking at the substance use, both in terms of, what happens when one's intoxicated, as well as those withdrawal symptoms, I think is really important. And then the other piece that sort of jumped out to me is just the issue of violence connected with the symptoms of mental illness, specifically with the whole biting event and so forth. I think this just really highlights, and I think Deb made the point, but just to kind of echo it again, is just the importance that, the treatment will be in terms of identifying the specific risks and needs, but also just the issue, I think, of monitoring and supervision. I think someone like Lisa is going to require, pretty regular, monitor, supervision, and so forth. This is someone who you don't want, to slip through the cracks. So I think that's just kind of another important component of, of working with someone like Lisa. So those are my thoughts. I think, like I said, both Deb and Sarah hit the big points.
Absolutely. Are there other panelists who want to jump in about Lisa? As I mentioned, this was based on a real case of someone I worked with. Spoiler alert, she did get out in her program and she did quite well, but it was a very challenging case to convince the judge and district attorney to release. We worked with her almost a year while she was incarcerated before she was released. She remained psychiatrically stable during that time. She remained compliant with her injectable medication. One of the arguments that we were able to make to the district attorney who had to consent to her release was, she had this other case with this assault at the family court building, and she got prison time, and then she got out and still was not doing well. Like, that didn't serve any purpose, really, we could argue. Incarceration didn't help. She got out. She was not engaged in any treatment. She had been on parole for a period of time. She finished parole. There was no supervision whatsoever. So you might as well try this now, because incarceration, didn't work in terms of reducing her recidivism, stabilizing her psychiatric issues. So why don't we try this, where she'll be very closely monitored on this ACT team. Her case was extremely, it was monitored very, very closely by the judge and district attorney's office. We sent, I think she initially had weekly court updates after she was released, just to make sure that she was engaging and compliant. And then she did end up continuing to use marijuana. We submitted a notification to the court every time she tested positive, and every time the judge would bring her back into court, whereas with some other clients, sometimes the judge would say, well, we'll just address this at the next court date. The judge was very patient with her, and he never remanded her or put her back in jail for using marijuana, because I think he understood, like, that was really not going to solve any of her issues. but he was very stern with her and really just reiterated the importance of her complying. And yeah, she did, like I mentioned, successfully complete our program. She was very lucky in that New York had just, at the time she was incarcerated, had started this pilot housing program for women that was a very, very low barrier transitional housing residence for women coming out of Rikers Island. That was also, you know, the difficult sell given the arson charge. A lot of residences, understandably, have rules against people charged with arson living in their facilities for insurance and safety reasons. But we really did a lot of advocacy with the housing provider and, you know, explained the collaboration that we would do with their staff. We had some other clients that had been in that residence, but it really was about that collaboration with the housing staff, so that they trusted that, you know, we would monitor her closely. We trusted that they would notify us right away if anything started you know, not going well, any signs of decompensation. And so that was just really key. So luckily, because that program was like a pilot and it was kind of grant funded, they were able to take her with the arson, which isn't the case for a lot of people, but that really helped her a lot also. Any other thoughts from the panelists about this case or any of the case vignettes? I mean, talking about case vignettes is like my favorite thing to do. I could just make up.
Yeah, they are so interesting.
Them for days.
Yeah. I want to just add something, Katie, that you mentioned. One is that this work requires relationship building and trust building between the provider community and the judicial court community and supervising entities. There's a lot of stigma and there's a lot of legitimate fear. I mean, this is not a case that's a minor case. There's victims here. And so, you know, these are really tough issues for people who really do want to keep society safe. And we can be, you know, we can't be Pollyannas to just say, well, the risk of mental illness is low and violence, and we're just I mean, this is a woman who did engage in risky behavior, and people were hurt and people could have gotten hurt. And so, you know, that's why I think some of that communication strategy is so key, because it also helps build that relationship, which also means I think in all of these cases you need, some people call them crisis plans or relapse plans, something to anticipate when things go awry, what's going to be, because it's not an if, it's a when. How do you address it? And so we've had programs where we have a telephone tree where we identify the definition of non-adherence, because somebody not showing up for one appointment for a legitimate reason may be fine, but somebody not showing up for 2 appointments where one had a legitimate reason because the bus got a flat tire, but the other had a questionable reason. You know, there's all this like weirdness that happens that you have to sort through. And so really trying to help the court say, look, 3 times we don't see her, we'll call you. You know, talk screens will let you know every time. I have seen, and you know, recently consulted in a jurisdiction where, you know, had they notified the court of a positive talk screen, they could have, the system got, you know, really there was a lot of concern that they had known information that wasn't shared. It also raises the issue of, is every single piece of information, like, I had a situation, I always say it was one of the times where I could have gotten fired probably, because we had a situation where somebody was using substances, had a peer support worker over the weekend, where the peer support worker was trying to encourage the person that we were working with to self-report to probation that they were using. Well, it turned out that the word got out that the peer support person was working with the person, but it sort of became like a, are they aiding and abetting? What's happening? Is the peer and this person now using together? There was this just gigantic leap of mistrust. And even though we tried to help explain to the judge that, no, this is our treatment model, that we try and encourage self-disclosure first and we give it 48 hours. But because we hadn't really spelled that out and it was a new program, there wasn't as much trust, so there was this leap to conclusion. Luckily, in that case, nothing bad happened, at least, you know, from a public safety standpoint. But there was a lot of, this was a program that I was 3 layers above in terms of contract management, but it was a program that we then had to do, like, really double down to rebuild that trust. Even, you know, even though this person's substance use became known to the court, there were no new victims, it was just something that, because of this rumor mill that happened, it got ahead of us, and then we kind of lost some traction in the trust, and we had to rebuild it over time, which we did. But I guess, and you can't always anticipate every bad outcome, but really building that trust is, I think, really part of it, and building these contingency plans.
Absolutely, and that's actually the focus of our 5th and final session of this diversion accounting, because it is so important to think about these things, and like you said, not if things go wrong, but when things go wrong, what you're going to do. You know, this is actually an interesting case, because I agree with what you're saying. It's so much about trust between the diversion program and the court stakeholders, where the actual chief administrative judge of Manhattan had initially had this case on his calendar, and he had, like, semi-retired and kind of gone into a different position, but he intentionally kept this case on his docket because he knew that he wanted to keep closely monitoring her, and wanted, you know, to keep that close communication with our program. So, you know, and he understood if I just pass this on to another judge, they wouldn't kind of know this history and know all this work. So that was, I think, a great move on his part. It's not always possible. You know, I had a supervisor once that said, you know, judges don't release people to programs, they release people to people. And that is just such, you know, building those relationships like we talked about is so key for diversion to work overall. And needing to trust that the people working with the participants are, yeah, trustworthy and going to notify them, you know, while working with clients on their recovery. Oh, you're muted, Deb.
Thanks. Another idea that people can think about as they're building out their programs is some things that we've done are these, like, lunch and learns and case discussions, hypothetical case discussions, or topical discussions, like how does a treatment provider deal with marijuana and cocaine abuse? Like, really educate, cross-training, lunch and learns, ways to help people understand that you're not just coming out of left field, you're not just there as a mental health professional to support, you know, liberty interests over and above everything else, but really that there is some methods that we use that are evidence-based, and then, you know, again, these, I find doing case vignettes with cross-disciplinary, cross-system really helpful so people can understand the perspectives of each other.
Thank you. Yeah, so we're going to take a break now until 3 o'clock. Then we're going to come back and we'll talk about one more case vignette. And then you'll break out into breakout groups and talk through them with your facilitator about whether you think that person is a good fit for diversion. You can also talk about, you know, Lisa and Jim, you know, thinking about their cases as well. And then we can talk, you know, as a group a bit more about these individual cases and, you know, who you want to be targeting for diversion. So, yeah, we'll come back here at 3 o'clock. So have a nice break.
And just so everybody knows, I am emailing a copy of each of these vignettes out to everybody who is registered as of 9 a.m. this morning, which was the last time I was able to pull down a registration report. So you should have all of the vignettes in your email box shortly. Thank you. All right, everybody, welcome back from the break. I'm gonna hand things back over to Katie, and we'll get going with our second part of the session. And I think Katie might be having a few connectivity issues, but I do know that the next thing that we're going to be doing is moving into our first breakout session for the day, where you will be working again with your facilitators that you had the last time, and you will be working on a third case vignette and just kind of assessing whether you think the individual in that vignette would be appropriate for this type of program, our DSH diversion program. And if you can all please check your email, I did send out a Word document just as the break was beginning that has all 3 case vignettes included in the document, so you'll have that to reference while you're in the breakout room, and then also as we move forward through this program. So please check your emails for that. And I know Katie is, I think, back on now.
Yes, I'm sorry. I don't know what happened. Yes, here we are. So I think, so we have Michael's vignette here, but like Ashley mentioned, you should have all gotten in your email. I'll just read it quickly to make sure we're all on the same page. So Michael is a 22-year-old homeless, single, unemployed African-American man who was arrested in San Francisco in 2019 and charged with felony assault. According to the arrest complaint, Michael was standing on a sidewalk downtown yelling delusional comments about ISIS and other related issues. A passerby approached Michael to try to de-escalate the situation, which agitated Michael, and he punched the complainant in the face. Michael had 3 prior convictions for misdemeanor petty larceny and riding the bus without payment. He had enrolled in outpatient mental health treatment at a local clinic prior to his arrest and was mostly compliant with his weekly appointments. He was diagnosed with schizophrenia and prescribed an oral antipsychotic medication, which he was inconsistently compliant with. He was experiencing homelessness and was living on the street at the time of his arrest, supporting himself primarily by panhandling. He had a history of marijuana and alcohol use and tested positive for both at the time of his admission to jail following his arrest. Michael presented as agitated and delusional at his arraignment and subsequent court hearings, but he was not physically aggressive or threatening. He was able to express a commitment to re-engage in mental health treatment and continue to take his prescribed medication. Oh, if released. Oh, I just heard that I'm not showing the right slide. Well, that's okay. How about we break into our breakout groups, which I think Ashley is going to do. So really you're just talking about, is Michael a good candidate for diversion? What treatment and supervision plan would you want to put in place for him? What are maybe some red flags that you'd want to address? You don't have to, develop an entire plan. We'll only have about 15 minutes, and then we'll come back and we'll talk about the case as a group. So I'm going to turn it back to Ashley.
All right, everybody. So I'm going to go ahead and open up the breakout rooms, and so you should all get the little box that asks you if you want to go in. Please say yes, you do, and we'll see you guys back here in, I think, about 15 minutes. Give me one moment.
Thank you.
Katie, I'm going to make you presenter again because I think that might be part of the problem with the slideshow.
Oh, okay. Thank you. I have many problems, so that's probably one of them. So I don't know. Okay. So we're now, okay, I'm not sure, I'm sorry, Ashley, how to get back to the slides. Oh, never mind, I figured it out. Okay. So now we're going to, I'm sorry, just talk about Michael's case. So while I'm fiddling with this, why don't we have my team, Stanislaus, talk about Michael's case and whether you thought he would be a good candidate for diversion.
And who from Stanislaus is going to be taking the lead?
I think I'm just going to call it Chandra Campbell.
Okay, let me find Chandra really quickly, and I will. Okay, Chandra, you should be unmuted.
So, the majority of our group decided that, yes, he would likely be a good candidate for diversion based on his qualifying diagnosis and the level of the charge. There was some additional information that, we would need prior to a final decision, but I think the majority was a yes.
Do you want to talk a little bit maybe about some of the information, some of the missing information that you would want to know before making like a final determination or when you're deciding on his treatment planning?
There was discussion about the victim, what level of harm was caused by the assault, some discussion about safety planning, housing, substance abuse treatment. All of that would need to be addressed as part of the treatment plan.
Mm-hmm. Good. Yeah, I mean, you also talked about, this seems like a typical case that you would see in your county. Obviously, housing was a part that we talked about, and it sounds like you do have some limited housing resources, but good. I'm sorry, I'm still fiddling with these slides. So I'm going to pass it to Hallie to introduce someone from her team.
Hey, everybody. Sorry that took a moment. So I was with Madera County. We only had, so we had 2 people in our group, Eric Rosen, and then we had Jeffrey, the prosecutor from San Joaquin County, wound up with us somehow, but we were thrilled to have him because we got into a good conversation about the differences, sort of how prosecutors see these programs. But maybe I can, so if it's possible to unmute both Eric and Jeffrey, I'd love to hear them talk through the case again.
All right, one moment. Eric is unmuted, and let me find Jeffrey. All right, you're both unmuted.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes,
yeah,
I can hear you. Oh, okay. All right. Yeah. So, I mean, the case we were both talking about just how we could help this person because they appear to have the diagnostic criteria down. But Jeffrey made mention of the housing being really important, and we both noticed the non-compliance of medication. And I made sure to I'd want to know more information about how he responded to medications when he took them, and perhaps see if he'd be open to a long-acting injectable. That would hopefully address at least a portion of the non-compliance and reduce some of the public safety, enhance the quality of treatment long enough so that he could respond better to behavioral interventions.
And my comment was, that's correctly focusing on the housing aspect, which has been a big deal for our program in San Joaquin County. Given that it's assaultive type conduct, history of noncompliance, as far as I'm concerned, for risk management purposes and public safety, I would feel better if we knew that he was in an appropriate shelter, being medicated, we know where he's supposed to be, things like that.
Great. Thank you both. Katie, back to you and the rest of the group.
Sure. Can you see the slide now?
Yes.
Oh, okay. Okay, great. Now I will pass it to Joey Hayashi to talk about your team.
Hey, Katie, thanks for sending it over to me. My team, San Joaquin, I think this is a perfect segue hearing what Jeffrey had to say. I believe Ellen was going to present for us. Yeah, if we can get Ellen unmuted. There we go.
Okay. Am I unmuted now? No.
Yes, you are. Ellen, you're unmuted.
Yeah.
My mute button.
No worries. I think Michael would be an ideal candidate to participate in the diversion program. I think one of the points that we brought up is the fact that Michael was not the initiator of the alleged assault. In fact, the passerby was the one who, for whatever reason, decided that he or she would take it upon themselves to escalate the situation. I also think it's noteworthy that none of his prior offenses, which were misdemeanors, had any violence associated with them. And in addition, his priors all reflected basically his inability to purchase or pay for items. So I think a lot of the issues that we need to address with Michael deal with poverty and his financial circumstances. I certainly feel that Michael needs a job, Michael needs SSI, Michael needs housing, and I agree with Jeff 100%. Housing is our most critical issue. And I think once Michael is stabilized, he will be a regular participant in programming, because he did express a commitment to re-engage in mental health treatment, which I think is very positive. He was inconsistently compliant with mental health treatment, but we also have to reflect upon the fact that he was experiencing homelessness and living on the street, which make it very, very difficult for people to comply with medication and treatment. Judy Ann, did you have anything you wanted to add?
I unmuted Judy Ann.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
The only other thing I wanted to add is I think that you made a really good point that I didn't think about, was that while he was inconsistent, this was voluntary enrollment in an outpatient mental health treatment. That he had signed up with it. And so while he had some issues, he actually sought out the help. So I think that that's a good sign that he's actually wanting it, even if his circumstances are making such that it's not always easy for him to do.
Excellent point.
Great, thank you so much. Those are all really great points. I'll now ask Sheila to introduce Nevada County.
Great, thanks, Katie. And I accidentally neglected to ask for a volunteer. So I'm going to ask someone from Nevada County. I don't know if you can unmute yourself. Perhaps you can raise your hand to volunteer to speak for the group. And if that's not possible, I'll try my best to, oh, it looks like we've got one for Jeff Goldman. Thank you, Jeff.
All right, so, I mean, most of what we talked about has already been said. We agree that they were a good fit for diversion. Some of the questions were from the DA's office was that behavior might not rise to the level of felony behavior in our county. So, I mean, that was one question. Also focusing on housing, we talked about
step-down housing and supportive housing, step down from the jail if they spend a long time in the jail, and with med compliance, and then supportive housing after that. And also the history or lack of history of violence was a key to them being a suitable candidate for diversion.
Thank you. Yeah, good points about like how different things might be charged in different counties for sure. And also, you know, the point made by San Joaquin that, you know, if you were to do like a violence risk assessment or just some kind of assessment, yeah, noting that he, you know, while he did assault somebody, he was not the necessarily instigator of the violence, essentially. Okay, great. Deirdre, I'm going to pass it to you.
Okay, we had a small group, but a great discussion. I'm going to ask Ryan Caceres to speak on what the group thought about Michael and his eligibility for diversion.
Ryan, you're unmuted. Did I unmute the right person?
Like it. It looks like we've lost some folks from our group. I'm scrolling through the attendees. Ryan, are you there?
Okay, that's okay. We can come back maybe. How about we go to Jen's team and then we can come back if needed.
Hi, with my team, Daniel Hawks is going to present, and I may mess up the name of this county, but Tuolumne County. Daniel is the Chief Probation Officer for the county, so he's going to talk about what we discussed.
All right,
Hi.
Daniel, you're unmuted.
Okay, great. So yeah, we had a very small group too, but we thought this sounded like a pretty typical case that would be included and be eligible. There was nothing on the face of it that looked like there would be anything to exclude or you know, find him ineligible to participate. It is a common situation for us to have individuals that are homeless or struggling with homelessness that have mental health issues. So there is a lack of housing in our county for long-term housing. We do have an enrichment center, which is a drop-in center for offenders. They could get all kinds of services, showers, food, and so even if we didn't have something available right away, we thought that potentially he could participate in that. We would be looking to peer support for additional services to help case manage, you know, a lot of the same things that have already been mentioned, like the medication services, potentially look into, you know, long-term injectables for better compliance. An eligibility specialist would be also somebody that would be referred to, likely to come up with some sort of long-term funding options or social SSI or whatever it may be. But we'd be looking to find him long-term housing. And it sounded like a very workable case, a very typical case for our county. Yeah, I guess that's about it.
Perfect, thank you.
And this is Jen. I think one of the great questions that came up during the group discussion, which I think is important to highlight, is a question around, you know, if certain resources don't exist in the county. So for example, if a person is homeless and needs housing, but there isn't housing available, or that resource isn't currently available, would that then make someone ineligible for the program? So there was some discussion around that.
Thank you. I'm now going to ask Sean, from DSH's perspective, what are your thoughts about Michael, and his eligibility and possible treatment plan?
Yeah, so I really liked the discussion and the points made. I think Michael is, sort of one of those more complicated than like Jim cases, but I do see him, again, depending on the kinds of services, that can be provided and so forth, a potential candidate for diversion. One thing I was going to say, and actually I meant to say this when we were talking about Lisa, and I think there's a lot of parallel between Michael and Lisa is, they have such unstable living situations that I think even, providing that could really address some of the risk issues. And so, I often see sort of these risk issues as being real opportunities, for targeted interventions and mitigating strategies to reduce that risk and, allow the person to sort of more reasonably be, safely and effectively treated in the community. So I really, echo a lot of those comments. I think the panel, the different counties have really hit, I think, a lot of the high points that I would also talk about as well.
Thank you. Anything else from any of the panelists, or if people want to, I know the muting is kind of tricky, but like raise their hand or put something in the chat about this case or any of the other cases we've talked about?
Katie, this is Sarah. I just wanted to jump in on one thing to circle back to something you said earlier in the session today. That felony assault on paper looks pretty scary. And then when you look at what it was actually in the context of, it's a very different picture. So here's an individual who was clearly experiencing psychotic symptoms and walking down the street, and the felony assault occurred in the context of somebody trying to de-escalate the situation. So it's very different than a picture of somebody who, again, is intentionally going out and committing, very serious violent offenses. So I just wanted to bring that point back, that also, looking at the charging offense would be different than potentially looking at the context of the charging offense.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. That's such an important point. Mm-hmm. Okay, so now, go ahead.
This is Deb. I agree with Sarah again. And I think, that individualized assessment, even with risk tools that can help guide us, they get combined to figure out really not just what is the risk level, but how do we build a plan that's going to mitigate the risk. And some people will list out, sort of what are the risk factors, and then for each factor, really try and address it with some plan. And I liked what one of the teams talked about. It may be that you just need more information to feel comfortable with supporting this individual. And so, gather the information that you need. Sometimes that can really help tip things one way or the other. And then I think the other thing is to think about is if this person isn't diverted, really what will happen to him? Where does he go? I mean, it goes back to your case that you said, okay, he goes in the criminal system, but he's going to come out again, and there's going to be issues again, and the community system's going to have to support him because he's got a chronic mental illness. And so, getting a jump start on building those relationships, I think will, benefit him in the long run as he goes through whichever pathway he goes through.
Yes, definitely. Because, this is a case, I mean, on paper, he probably, if he gets jail time, he's not going to do a really significant amount of jail or prison time, and yet he's going to be out again. And we really want to try to keep breaking the cycle as much as we can. Okay, great. Well, thank you all for the great discussion. I apologize for some of these, breakout room issues. I know it's not, so just thank you for your patience with us. So now we're going to talk a bit about screening and assessment kind of basics. A lot of this, I'm sure, is familiar to most of you, but as we continue to talk about, you know, that screening and assessment piece is so key to starting this diversion program and process. So we're just going to go over kind of some basics, and then we're going to have Dr. Sarah Demaray talk about risk assessments in particular. Then we're going to take another little break. Then we're going to do more breakout sessions and talk through more of the questions from your program planning guide. Again, I'm going to go through this fairly quickly, but what is universal screening? It's using standardized, validated tools on all individuals booked into a jail to identify people who may have behavioral health needs, and they can determine if further assessment is needed. You know, many of you don't work in the jails directly, so you're not doing these screenings, but I think it's just important to be aware of what's going on in the jails because it's so important to have that collaboration from the jail to the program to the court, et cetera. Screenings are short in duration. You can use information that's routinely available. They can be self-administered if appropriate, or ideally by properly trained jail staff. And screenings typically do not contain protected health information. You can do screenings for mental health symptoms or issues, substance use, pretrial risk, which we'll talk about, and suicide risk. It's really important to think about who is administering the screening tools in your jail and how are they trained. Are correction officers doing these, you know, brief mental health screenings? And all these people can do them for sure. Are they nurses? Are they some kind of mental health staff, clinicians, caseworkers? But also, you know, especially in some of your smaller counties that may not have a lot of staffing available, you know, can other people be involved in the screening process? You know, I know we've heard in some places like defense attorneys can go into the jail and help with screenings. I mean, there's a lot of nuance to this. You can't just go in and start doing this. Can community members, can peers be pulled in to do some of this work? That's kind of interesting things to think about. You know, here are some just examples of mental health screening tools that exist. The brief jail mental health screen is very widely used. The correctional mental health screen for men. Those initials should be over there, I'm sorry. The mini international neuropsychiatric interview screen and the mental health screening form. Again, these are fairly brief screenings that any, you know, discipline can do. Also, substance use disorder screening examples, the SSISA, the TCU drug screen, and the alcohol, smoking, and substance involvement screening test. You know, I should have said, of course, the ideal situation is that everybody coming into your jail is screened for mental health and substance use and suicide risk, which we'll talk about, and then those results are shared with the appropriate staff in the jail and determine whether or not a further assessment is needed. But also, you know, in terms of diversion, you know, trying to get people out of jail as soon as possible to make sure they're screened as soon as possible, you know, who's getting those results as soon as possible, so you can flag who may have a serious mental illness, who may have a qualifying diagnosis for diversion. Then there's other pretrial risk screen examples, which Sarah Demaray is going to talk more about later, so I'm not really going to go into these. And just, you know, obviously suicide risk is so important. I just wanted to touch on a few points about the importance of it. Incarcerated people have a 6 to 7.5 times greater risk of suicide than the general population. Males account for 93% of completed suicides, and among people in jail, that suicide risk is highest within the first month of incarceration. Over half of completed suicides in jail occur within the first 2 weeks of someone's incarceration, and 80% of suicides occur within 2 days of a court hearing. Again, just highlighting the importance of doing suicide risk assessment in the jail as soon as possible, you know, especially for this population of people that have serious mental illness who are then incarcerated are also at very high risk for suicide. You know, suicide risk assessments can be self-administered, but ideally they should not be. They should be administered by trained staff for safety, because then staff can indicate if someone needs an immediate intervention to prevent suicide, and they can gather additional information to more fully assess someone's suicide risk. And this is just some more kind of statistics about the rate of suicide in jail, which is very high. You know, in cases of completed suicides in jails, 37% were assessed, only 37% were assessed for their suicide risk. Approximately half of all completed suicides in a jail occur within 3 days of a clinical assessment. And while many facilities provide close observation of people deemed to be at risk for suicide, they're sometimes not continuous, and there's not a lot of follow-up. So again, given the high rates of suicide in the criminal justice settings, implementation of an evidence-based instrument for screening and assessment of suicide risk is critically important. You know, some of you may be following the news in New York City, especially. Rikers Island has had a lot of in-custody deaths in the last year, many of which have been deemed suicide. So there's just a lot of attention, as there should be right now, on this issue. And here are some examples of suicide screenings, the Beck scale for suicide ideation and the adult suicide ideation questionnaire. And just a note that the QPR Institute does offer some free virtual or in-person suicide prevention trainings that anyone can take. Some of them you do have to pay for, but some of them are free, which is just great, like basic information, because it's such an important topic that really everyone should have some familiarity with. You know, also we just wanted to talk a bit about the cultural considerations for screening and assessment. I don't want to just read slides, but given the disproportionate number of people of color and Native people in the justice system, obviously screening and assessments should be highly attentive to the influences of ethnicity, social class, gender, sexual orientation, race, disability status, socioeconomic level, and religious and spiritual affiliation. And being aware, and this is true in screening and assessment and in treatment when you're working with divergent participants, that symptoms of mental illness may present differently among different ethnic and racial groups, and unless cultural norms are well understood and sufficient follow-up is allowed to assess and understand the full meaning of atypical self-reported thoughts, emotions, and behaviors, these symptoms may be misinterpreted, leading to misdiagnosis, inappropriate use of medication, and placement in inappropriate levels of care. So just again, really the key importance of using culturally sensitive screening and assessment tools as much as possible, because research demonstrates that culturally specific treatment programming and building cultural capacity among staff can increase the accuracy of results in screening and assessment. You know, here are just some of the important cultural themes to consider during the assessment and treatment process: religiosity, related beliefs and customs, cultural orientation, trust versus distrust of authority figures, gender roles. You know, language barrier is a huge issue, especially in doing screening and assessments when you're using tools that are not available in languages other than English. So whenever possible, screening and assessment should be conducted in the individual's language of choice or by staff of a similar cultural background. You know, of course, it's not always possible, but that really should be the ideal. You know, I don't know if some of your jails have access to like phone translation services, which is not ideal, but that's an option. And then just quickly, the basics of an assessment. That is a longer process than a screening that collects more comprehensive information, like people's pathways to criminal involvement, criminogenic needs, clinical needs, strengths and protective factors, social and community needs. Those are conducted by appropriately trained professionals. You know, thinking about in your jails and your facilities, who gets access to those assessment results? Because again, that's so important when you're trying to get people assessed and into diversion. Do jail mental health staff get access to those? Medical staff, like nurses or medical doctors? Do people's defense attorneys, do the district attorneys, do the community diversion program staff, can they get access with the right consents in place? Because, yeah, you want to be careful about what type of information is shared with whom, but you also want to make sure there can be collaboration from the very beginning when someone's incarcerated. Of course, all of this, you know, we recognize that all screening and assessment and all work in jails, there's many barriers. There's physical space limitations, time constraints, inadequate staffing. There can be a lack of communication between custody and behavioral health staff. There can be, you know, challenging participants who may be very difficult to engage to get through a screening or assessment given a variety of issues, you know, the trauma they've experienced during their arrest and incarceration, their psychotic symptoms. They could be detoxing from substances. They could just have a challenging personality, to be honest. So these are all things, of course, to keep in mind. You know, I don't have answers to these barriers, but we know that they exist for sure. Okay, so that was very quick. Are there any questions or thoughts about screening and assessment and how it relates to diversion before we turn it over to Sarah? Okay, well then I am going to turn it over to Sarah Desmarais, who's going to talk more specifically about risk assessment for this population.
Thanks, Katie. And if you can go to the next slide. Thanks. So I wanted to anchor the conversation, and really it's just an introduction today. So you're going to be hearing a lot more from me on the topic of risk assessment and management, but today I wanted to anchor us into this idea of thinking about who is appropriate for diversion. And so, you know, throughout the day, we've been talking about the different things we need to be thinking about, the different criteria. Next slide, please. I wanted to really dig into this idea of what is an unreasonable risk of danger to the public, and how do we know if that's present. Next slide, please. So the first thing that I always do when I'm working with different communities or jurisdictions is to look at what the definition is. So in California, this idea of unreasonable danger to public safety is defined as an unreasonable risk that the individual will commit a new violent felony. And I think we need to anchor ourselves back in this legal definition and in the criteria so that we're not allowing ourselves to stray or drift into our own or even our community's definition of the term danger or the term unreasonable. So if we start here with this kind of common definition, we can then look outward and start to think about what cases would be relevant. And I would encourage you all to think about this from the point of view of risk assessment instead of relying uniquely on the charging offense. For some of the reasons that we've talked about already so far, the way that something looks on paper, whatever that offense might be, is actually potentially very different than an understanding of what the behavior itself was, and then also separate from that, what the likelihood of a future violent felony behavior might be. Next slide, please. So here, just to really drive home this point, I wanted to talk about the two components. So unreasonable, it doesn't mean that there is no threat, and I think Deb actually introduced this idea in one of her responses during a previous panel today too. So it's not that it's no threat, that there isn't going to be some level of risk, or even that we don't expect some level of recidivism. It's not even that it's a low threat. What we're saying is that it is an unreasonable threat. It cannot be managed with the resources available in the community. And a threat of what? So are there resources available in your community, not just to prevent any kind of violation of conditions? So it's not just about if they have you know, a dirty urine screen, or if they fail to show up at a meeting or that kind of thing. It's not that they are at risk of any new crime. It could very well be, and honestly likely, that they're going to engage in new low-level crime. And it's also not that they're at risk of any new felony. It's that we're looking very specifically at an unreasonable threat that cannot be managed with the resources in your community for a new violent felony offense. This is actually a very high bar if we really think about it, especially as we dig into what are the rates of recidivism, or what are the rates of new violent felony behavior in this particular population. It's actually not all that high. So we've got to really dig into not what is kind of the lay understanding of danger to the public, but what is the actual definition that is inherent both in the California legal definition and then in this specific diversion program requirements. Next slide, please. So I wanted to talk a little bit about this idea of danger to public safety and just make 5 key points today. We're going to come back again to talk about risk assessment and risk mitigation through many more of these sessions. The first thing that I wanted to just share, and you know, many of you are already familiar with these statistics, or maybe you've heard me talk about these things before, is that mental illness really accounts for a very small proportion of violence in the general population in our communities. So really only 3 to 5% of what is happening out there. It's not to say that those 3 to 5% aren't important in serious cases. It's just to kind of dispel that myth that individuals with serious mental illnesses, or specifically that meet the criteria and the diagnostic categories for this diversion program, that they're kind of running around accounting for all of this community level violence. And then the second statistic there is that even fewer of those individuals are going to be engaging in any gun violence, which is one of the most serious forms in terms of the impact on the victim and the likelihood of serious injury. So in fact, the folks that we're talking about are really actually much more, and statistically more likely to be themselves the victim of violent crime. And so, you know, talking about suicide risks, but also considering risks to themselves from others. So I wanted to just kind of bring that point in again as well. And then the fourth point there is that even when they are engaging in violent incidents, and this is from work that we did with a nationally representative sample of people with psychotic conditions and who were engaging in community violence, if and when they did engage in community violence, the vast majority of it was not in this kind of public domain, but occurring more in private residences and not just out on the streets being a danger to everyone around them. So all of those first 4 points really talking about what is that connection with this idea of danger to public, and that the threshold of unreasonable danger to public safety is actually quite high. Then finally, I wanted to make on the point as we transition into discussions of risk assessment that people with serious mental illnesses in jails and in other settings where we're doing this work, they are included in the studies that are being conducted to validate the risk assessment instrument. So in other words, we don't need to additionally take into consideration their mental illness above and beyond what might be considered already in the risk assessment instrument. So, you know, these studies of risk assessment tools that we'll talk about, different ones we'll talk about a little bit later and go into further detail in the coming weeks. It's not as if those studies all exclude individuals coming through jails or other settings that have serious mental illness. So we don't want to be double counting the role of their mental illness when they've already been part of this validation sample or population. Next slide, please, Katie. So what does this mean when we're thinking about who is appropriate for diversion? First of all, you're going to have all folks who have a certain categories of mental health diagnoses. You're going to need to understand the role of the mental disorder in the offenses. And then here, you need to, and when we're getting into risk assessment, is to know and estimate the level of risk of danger that that person presents to others if they were to be released into the community. And then importantly, to identify and engage in the strategies and interventions that would manage that risk in the community. And, you know, fast forward to some other things we're going to talk about later, but also how to monitor that. And that's been brought up a few times already through the group discussions and in our panel sessions. Next slide, please. So all this to say that really to do this well and to do it in a way that can, you know, promote the best outcomes for everyone, including the individual, including your program, the diversion program, and also the community more largely, is that we need to be doing what would be considered a defensible risk assessment that can then inform these decisions about appropriateness for diversion and the interventions that are needed to be put in place to manage that risk in the community. So how do we get to a defensible risk assessment? Next slide, please, Katie. So risk assessment is not an outcome, it is a process. So we're going to engage in a process, and hopefully repeatedly over time, of looking at the factors that are associated with that threat to public safety, using that information to identify the likelihood and severity of what that behavior would look like, use this information to inform decision-making, then engage in strategies to prevent that thing from happening. So all part of this process is both thinking about not just kind of the identification and eligibility and appropriateness, but also how are we going to do this in the way that can promote the safety of everyone involved, and really having strategies in place to monitor if there are changes, because there absolutely will be circumstances in which somebody's risk is elevated or that we're unable to monitor or manage that risk safely, and we need to have strategies in place in the community, within the family. And, you know, I think we had some good discussion about some strategies, even just with the case examples, that we can really do our best to prevent adverse outcomes from happening. Next slide, please. So I've talked about a few of these things already, but I really wanted to just drill into these two ideas of eligibility and case management. So in the context of mental health diversion, which is slightly different than some other risk assessment contexts, the first is that we want to actually think about whether the person presents a sufficient level of risk. So as I noted earlier, it's not that we're really looking or targeting low risk. What we're wanting to do instead is to really think about, does this person that you're considering for diversion, do they have actually a sufficient level of risk to warrant all of these resources that we're talking about, right? So the diversion programming is a fairly intensive kind of program. If we say somebody is at low risk, well, that usually means that they're able to kind of go about their business and be successful on their own. What we're looking for is really this kind of sweet spot of enough risk that we can kind of justify and engage in an appropriate level of service and intervention, but also that the resources are there in the community to help manage it. We'll talk more detail about principles and practices to make this happen as we move forward in the Diversion Academy. The second issue there is then this case management idea, and you know, Deb has really done a wonderful job of starting to bring into the conversation ideas about how do we do a very comprehensive and collaborative treatment planning and case management process. So here, I just wanted to throw in some ideas that we'll be returning to that, you know, there's going to be a lot of tools in our toolkit. It's going to require a lot of conversation and collaboration between different groups. So we're going to be considering things like the conditions that are in place. We're going to be considering things like supervision strategies, the frequency of supervision meetings, court appearances, or other kind of treatment contact. And then also thinking about the dosage of the treatment itself, whether that's pharmacological treatment, but also thinking about treatment dosage as it relates to psychosocial interventions.
I wish I had a magical answer that you could, just look at a grid and say this person needs this level, this person needs this level, but it will be a very individualized case process. Next slide, please. So I know you're waiting for me to get to the point to say, hey, here's the tools that you should be using. I wanted to just emphasize that a risk assessment instrument is not the same thing as a risk assessment process. So even if you're going to be implementing, which I recommend you do, a structured risk assessment tool, it doesn't mean that it negates all those other things that are going to need to happen. So you're still going to need strategies for monitoring. You're still going to need to think about how you collaborate and communicate. The risk assessment tool will really just provide more structure and evidence behind these decisions and really help support a defensible decision-making process. Next slide, please. Thanks. So here, just on this idea of a defensible decision, there are at least 7 criteria, and jurisdictions I work with get very nervous about risk assessment and about, when we're looking at feedback on barriers to diversion programming, a lot of it is about concerns regarding public safety, and that's very appropriate. So what we can do is just try to do our best to go through, use an evidence-based approach to try to get at the best decisions, and then have strategies in place to do our best to prevent adverse outcomes. Here are 7 strategies that you can kind of check, or checks and balances you can use. Did all the reasonable steps were they taken? Was a reasonable assessment method used? Was the information that was collected evaluated and thought through? If there was missing information, is there a strategy to get that information? Were the decisions recorded? This is something I just want to mention, that sometimes jurisdictions and individuals shy away from writing down the results of the risk assessment, but that is, in my view, the opposite of what you should be doing. You should actually be documenting these steps in the process to provide the evidence and the transparency to show how and why you went through this decision making, and how and why you determined that this person was or was not eligible. Of course, these decisions should be made within policies and procedures, and specifically within the criteria of this diversion program. And then ultimately, you need to be communicating with others, very collaboratively in terms of risk assessment and management, and then, case planning and intervention more broadly. Diversion programming really is a collaborative process. Next slide, please. So here are the risk assessment instruments, as I alluded to. They're one strategy to ensure that you're getting through that defensible decision-making process. So they can increase structure, they can increase consistency, they increase transparency, they also increase accuracy in evaluating this idea of unreasonable threat to public safety. They can provide evidence that help you as you're faced with decisions about who is at greater or lesser risk, and therefore greater or lesser eligibility. They can support your decisions and then also inform risk management. Next slide, please. Here are a whole bunch of different examples of risk assessment tools. I put them under the category of what they were primarily intended to forecast. So there are some tools that are focused more broadly on recidivism risk, typically general offending. So these will probably include a range of behaviors that is much broader in scope than our definition of unreasonable threat to public safety for your diversion program. The instruments that are intended specifically to focus on violence risk, a few of those I mean there, those are going to be forecasting violent behavior that doesn't necessarily fit within, but could fit within the criteria of violent felony. And so they're, really focusing on the nature of the behavior itself as opposed to an offense category. And then we have instruments that are more specific. So, we have subsets of tools that focus specifically on sexual violence or specifically on domestic violence. And then finally, they're bringing back, as Katie mentioned, the tools that are focused on pretrial risk.
what I wanted to mention about the pretrial risk assessment tools is that they're quite typically narrowly focused on outcomes during the pretrial period, meaning from the time of arrest and pretrial release through to the end of the case disposition. And those are primarily focused on whether the individual will fail to appear in a court or engage in new criminal activity during the pretrial period, which is a bit of a difference from what we're thinking about here if we're talking about risk assessment in the context of mental health diversion. It doesn't mean that there isn't value to considering the outcomes of these tools, but I do want to just clarify that they've got a slightly different focus. So the VCRA, for example, doesn't have a separate scale specifically focused on new violent criminal activity. The public safety assessment does, but again, it'll be focused more specifically on, this traditional definition of pretrial risk. We'll talk more about these, and as we move forward, I'm happy to kind of provide suggestions or talk with folks about what might be a good fit for their community. Next slide, please. Oh, great. Okay, that's all I have for risk assessment for now. Again, you'll be hearing much more from me throughout the rest of the academy on this topic.
Thank you, Sarah. I know it's kind of hard again to ask questions, but any questions for Sarah, either in the chat or if you wanted to raise your hand and Ashley can unmute you. All right, well, like Sarah mentioned, she will be back, so you can think about questions for her and or send them to Ashley and or talk about them in your breakout groups, and we can share them with Sarah and Ashley. But now we're going to have another quick break, and then we're going to come back and do some more breakout group work. So let's take a break until we'll have 7 minutes. So we'll come back at 4:20. Thank you, Ashley. Yeah, great. There's like a orb of light coming in. I'll fix that in a second. That's kind of distracting. But yeah, I thought it might be good to just come back as a larger group now to talk through, we had a lot of questions to get there in terms of the program plan, but I think it's also just worthwhile to talk through like what some of the key takeaways were from today from all of your perspectives. Kind of your initial thoughts about how you plan to refer and assess and evaluate if people are appropriate fits for diversion, thoughts about risk assessment or anything that we've talked about today and how you'll implement that in your county. So I'm not quite sure what the best way to do this is. I guess I'll just start with Stanislaus. If Sandra can be unmuted to just talk a bit about what they have going on in Stanislaus.
Sandra's unmuted.
Sandra, are you there? Oh, it was Sandra. S-A-N-D-R-A.
Oh, apologies. 1 second.
That's okay. That's okay.
All right, Sandra.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. So kind of how we do it right now in Stanislaus County is often the attorney will send me an action request, AR we call them, and it'll just give me an idea of what I need to do. So it'll talk about the alleged incident and maybe some of the symptoms the client was experiencing during the alleged incident. And so then I will oftentimes go visit the client in jail, talk with them a little bit, kind of get an idea of what I'm looking at, ask appropriate questions about how they were feeling during the time, maybe if there's any SUD going on, and kind of what they want to do, what they think might be helpful to them. I kind of try to give them the buy-in. I feel like it's more helpful if they feel like they're a part of it. And then I make an appropriate referral to either SUD or mental health program to do an assessment. And then we go from there. It's kind of a new thing. I've been doing this since June Jeremy, my coworker, has been doing this since May. We went live in July, so we're still really new at it. We're kind of figuring it out as we go along. I feel like this diversion training is kind of helping us get more organized and make it more streamlined, and everybody seems to be on the same page, which is nice and helpful. We oftentimes, it's helpful if the judge is on board, and we kind of discuss those things before we even take it to court to see if everybody's on the same page and what everybody's kind of thinking about. So far, it seems to be working well. Learning as we go.
Great. And I'm sorry, I should have explained at the beginning. You are a caseworker in the public defender's office.
Yes.
So, you know, you have a newly developed holistic defense practice, which is really great. I'm not sure how many other counties here have something similar, but I think that's a really great tool also for diversion. Like you mentioned, you can really be that connection between the attorney and the behavioral health program. That I think for this population is really important. So, you know, I highly encourage any other counties that have that type of role in your public defender's office to really, develop a process and try to use the additional staff as much as possible. Anything else from our Stanislaus group? Okay, I guess I'll keep kind of passing it to each facilitator to then introduce someone on the team, if that makes sense. So I'll pass it to Hallie. Well, no, Hallie, your Madeira group. No, we won't pass it to Hallie. We'll pass it to Jen in Tuolumne.
Thank you, Katie. So our group is small but mighty today. So we have a public defender and the chief probation officer who are in attendance today, and there's some turnover in the behavioral health agency. And so, you know, we talked a little bit about, you know, they were able to share kind of what's going on in their county, and definitely raise your hand, Daniel or Hallie, if you want to talk some more specifically, but definitely looking at kind of wanting to learn from some other systems to find out who are more advanced in the diversion process, either kind of general mental health diversion or in the IST specifically, in order to learn, since this would be new within their county. And also, they shared that they had a great session in between these two sessions with all of the players, including judges, the judge in the county, as well as behavioral health agency, to be able to ensure that there's support moving forward. So there's some work going on in the county in between sessions to kind of move things forward. But I'll definitely, you know, turn it over to Dan or Hallie if you wanted to add some additional information. So since we were small, we weren't able to really get into some of the details around kind of what the program would look like.
I unmuted Daniel and Hallie just in case.
Thanks. I'm Hallie. I'm a public defender here in Tuolumne County. Dan is from probation, and we really expressed the desire to maybe team up or be partners with a county that has already a plan in place. I know there's like some pilot programs or trial programs out there. That's what we were hoping for, so we could get a better idea of how to do this for our county.
We know we have support for it in Tuolumne County. We just, you know, we don't want to reinvent the wheel if we don't have to. So whatever assistance we can get from other counties, that'd be great.
Yes, that is really great feedback. And we definitely want to try to incorporate, counties that are currently doing this work in our future sessions. Because I agree that's like the best way to learn in a lot of ways. Okay, Deirdre, do you want to go next?
Yeah, thanks, Katie. So I'm going to break tradition and ask a question that came up in our session that I did not have a solid answer to. But for the team, if you did want to add something, please go ahead and raise your hand so that you can be unmuted. But my team asked, if a person fails out of the diversion program and they had already had a competency evaluation, since the court agrees to pay for the first, and they needed to return to the court process, who would pay for that second evaluation to see if they were still incompetent to stand trial?
Yeah, Ashley or Sean, I'm going to turn that over to you.
Yeah, so it's a very good question. It would likely still be the courts. The Department of State Hospitals does not pay for those assessments. You could probably theoretically use your DSH diversion program funding if that was an issue, because there are little, or I would say there are almost no restrictions on how you can use the funding that we are providing to you to support your program, as long as it is in support of the program and the folks that you are diverting through our program. We also have, we're starting an IST reevaluation service through DSH right now, although I think in this particular instance, the IST reevaluation service only really takes place when somebody is already committed to DSH and waiting for admission. So this would be kind of almost like an in-between case. So it's an interesting question, but it would either, I think, in terms of payment, it would be the courts if that's who typically pays for it in your county, or you could potentially use some of your DSH funding for the program to pay for those second assessments.
Thank you. Okay, good. We'll keep going. Joey, I'm going to pass it to you with San Joaquin County.
Thanks, Katie. So we were only able to get through the first 4 questions, but we did have a really engaging conversation around them. We didn't pick anyone to speak for, but I think I will ask Judy Ann if she can just kind of point out the highlights of what we discussed.
Sure. So what we talked about is we want to, probably the initial referrals is going to be coming from most likely the defense attorneys. Sometimes the district attorney's office in our county will get some reports ahead of time and we'll be able to flag them to. We would like all parties to be engaged if possible. What we're anticipating is to hopefully send out a social worker who can gather the medical records, and maybe do a quick evaluation with the client, find out their history, their mental health history, their family support system, and just kind of figure out where they are and what their needs are, and see if we think they would be a good fit for the program just based on that first, and then refer it over to have the doctor evaluate them and determine whether or not they meet all of the needs for the program. After that, I would anticipate some sort of discussion with our office, the district attorney's office, and seeing if we can come to an agreement on who we can allow in. And then I think we still need to hash out what do we do if we don't agree on an individual. So that's kind of the process of envisioning it right now. But we still have to figure out, what specific assessment tools we're going to be using, what the exact requirements will be. I think we all agree that there are certain categories of crimes that we won't be admitting, but other than that, we don't have anything fleshed out.
Great, thank you. And finally, I'll pass it to Sheila with Nevada County.
Thanks, Katie. Yeah, we lost some of our group in Nevada County, so our breakout group is a little bit smaller, but we had representation from probation district attorney and public defender's offices. We had the public defender, the district attorney, and the chief probation officer as part of our group. And a lot of the discussion was around what are the current tools being used in Nevada County, what are the pretrial risk assessments, what are the risk assessments, what are the mental health screening tools, what are the assessments, what's being shared with what's being shared with whom, and a little bit of a discussion around what the process could potentially look like. How would candidates be referred? What does that look like? And talking about how for mental health diversion, thinking that this process would be probably similar to that. The IST diversion would follow a similar process of that of mental health diversion. But of course, we'd like to open it up to the folks in Nevada County and see if you all would like to add anything or chime on in. And those folks actually would be Jeff Goldman, Jesse Wilson, and Carrie Klein. Not sure if you all had anything to add, but wanted to give you an opportunity to jump on in if you'd like.
And you're all unmuted now.
Say from probation, I don't have anything to add. I don't know if Carrie or Jesse has anything.
I don't have anything to add. This is Carrie.
Yeah, this is Jesse. Nothing to add. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Yeah, this was really great. And yeah, hearing all of your takeaways has been really helpful. I think for these last few minutes, I'm turning it back to Ashley to close us out.
All right, everybody, thank you so much for joining us again today, and I just want to apologize for all of the technical difficulties we are having. We are learning, I think today, what a tricky platform WebEx can be, so I apologize again. We'll do our best to manage some of these issues as they come up through the session, so we appreciate your patience and sticking this out with us. Just a quick reminder that we have about a 2.5-week break until we have our next session, session 3, 4, and 5, which will be pretty much one after the other on November 1st, November 3rd, and November 8th. We will be focusing during those sessions on appropriate treatments and services for this type of programming, housing, and then ongoing risk management in the community for these types of diversion programs. And I will be emailing you all with some county homework that will help you prepare for those upcoming sessions. We are going to ask that each county complete an inventory of the various services that you currently have available in your community that would be eligible for this program. There is a template that we will be sending out. It was loaned to us by the Council on Criminal Justice and Behavioral Health from a different training that the Council of State Governments did for that team. So we're very grateful for them for being willing to share the template. So you will see that in your email along with the slides from today and the vignettes again. If you have any questions, please reach out to us at any time. I think most of you at this point probably have my email, so you can always reach out to me directly. You can also reach out at dshdiversion@dsh.ca.gov, and we can connect with you that way as well. I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day and a great rest of the month, and we will see you in November. Thank you so much.